Welcome to a journey through the darker corners of criminal history. Tonight, we'll explore 100 stories about some of the most infamous serial killers the world has known. Let these tales carry you gently into sleep as we examine the patterns, the investigations, and the psychology behind these cases. Close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's begin. Story 1: The Origins of the Term. Our first story takes us back to the 1970s, when the term serial killer itself was born. Before FBI agent Robert Ressler coined this phrase, these criminals were called many things: mass murderers, spree killers, or simply monsters. Ressler drew inspiration from the serial adventure films of his childhood, where audiences would return week after week for the next installment. He realized that these killers operated in a similar pattern, committing murders in a series, with cooling-off periods in between. The FBI formally adopted the term in the 1970s, defining a serial killer as someone who murders 3 or more victims in separate events with emotional cooling-off periods between kills. This distinction separated them from mass murderers, who kill many people at once, and spree killers, who murder multiple victims without a cooling-off period. The term revolutionized how law enforcement approached these cases, allowing them to identify patterns and develop profiles. By 1988, the definition was refined further at a symposium in San Antonio, Texas, where experts from around the world gathered to establish consistent criteria. This linguistic shift wasn't just academic, it fundamentally changed investigative techniques and helped catch killers who might otherwise have continued their crimes across multiple jurisdictions. Story 2: The Behavioral Science Unit. In the 1970s, deep in the basement of the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, something extraordinary was taking shape. A small team of agents began doing what had never been systematically done before, interviewing imprisoned serial killers to understand how they thought. Special agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler would travel to prisons across America, sitting down face-to-face with the most dangerous criminals in the country. They interviewed Edmund Kemper, who stood 6'9" and had murdered his own grandparents as a teenager before going on to kill 6 young women and his mother. They spoke with Charles Manson, Richard Speck, and dozens of others. These conversations, often lasting hours, revealed patterns that had never been documented. The agents learned that many serial killers had experienced childhood trauma, particularly between the ages of 8 and 12. They discovered the concept of the homicidal triad: bedwetting, fire setting, and cruelty to animals in childhood, though later research would show this wasn't as predictive as initially thought. Most importantly, they learned that these criminals could be categorized into organized and disorganized types based on their crime scenes. This groundbreaking work laid the foundation for modern criminal profiling, transforming it from guesswork into a systematic investigative tool that has helped solve countless cases. Story 3: The Organized Mind. Let's drift into understanding the organized serial killer, a type that plans meticulously and leaves little evidence behind. These individuals lead what appears to be normal lives. They have jobs, relationships, and blend seamlessly into society. Ted Bundy exemplified this type perfectly. He was charismatic, educated, and worked on political campaigns. He carefully selected victims who resembled each other, approached them with elaborate ruses, and transported them to pre-selected locations. The organized killer typically has above-average intelligence and follows their crimes closely in the media. They often take souvenirs from victims, not as trophies in the traditional sense, but as memory triggers to relive the experience. Their crime scenes show evidence of planning. They bring weapons and restraints, control the victim, and often clean up afterward. BTK killer Dennis Rader represented this type as well, maintaining a family life and career while meticulously documenting his crimes. These killers engage in conversation with victims, sometimes for hours, as psychological domination is part of their motivation. They are often geographically mobile, which historically made them difficult to catch before modern databases connected crimes across jurisdictions. Understanding this organized pattern helped investigators realize they weren't looking for the obvious suspect, the loner or drifter, but someone who might be their neighbor, colleague, or even friend. Story 4: The Disorganized Reality. Now let's turn to the disorganized serial killer, whose crimes tell a very different story. These individuals act on impulse, leaving chaotic crime scenes that reveal much about their state of mind. The disorganized killer typically has below-average intelligence and struggles with mental illness. They often live alone or with a parent, have poor social skills, and work in menial jobs if employed at all. Their crimes are spontaneous, they use whatever weapon is available at the scene rather than bringing one. The victim is usually someone from their own neighborhood, killed quickly without prolonged interaction. Richard Chase, known as the Vampire Killer of Sacramento, demonstrated this pattern dramatically in the late 1970s. He suffered from severe mental illness and chose victims based on whether their doors were unlocked, interpreting a locked door as a sign he wasn't welcome. His crime scenes were extremely chaotic, with evidence left everywhere. The disorganized killer makes little effort to hide the body or clean the scene, often leaving the victim at the initial attack location. They typically don't follow media coverage of their crimes and may have amnesia-like gaps in memory about the events. Unlike their organized counterparts, they rarely take souvenirs, though they might engage in unusual behavior with the body itself. Understanding this classification helped investigators narrow suspect pools dramatically. They could estimate the killer's intelligence, living situation, and even employment status based on what the crime scene revealed. Story 5: The FBI's Database Revolution. As the 1980s unfolded, the FBI realized that information was the key to catching serial killers who crossed state lines. In 1985, they launched VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. This revolutionary database allowed law enforcement agencies across the country to input details about violent crimes and search for similar cases. Before VICAP, a killer moving from California to Florida could operate with near impunity, as police departments had no efficient way to connect crimes across jurisdictions. The system required officers to fill out detailed questionnaires about crime scenes, victim characteristics, and suspect behavior. The computer would then search for pattern matches. Within its first decade, VICAP helped connect numerous cases that had seemed unrelated. A murder in Oregon might share 19 specific characteristics with one in Georgia, suggesting the same perpetrator. The database looked for unusual details, not just victim type, but things like whether the killer posed the body, used specific knots in ligatures, or left particular items at scenes. By the 1990s, DNA databases would enhance this system further, but VICAP represented the first major technological leap in tracking these criminals. It transformed serial killer investigation from individual department efforts into a coordinated national approach, and similar systems were eventually adopted by other countries around the world. We've explored just 5 stories so far, and already we can see how understanding evolved over decades. As you continue to relax, let these narratives wash over you, knowing that behind each dark tale lies the dedicated work of investigators who brought justice. We have 95 more stories to discover together on this journey. Rest now, and let's continue. Story 6: The Cooling Off Period. One of the most distinctive characteristics that separates serial killers from other murderers is the cooling off period, and understanding this phenomenon changed everything about how investigators approached these cases. After a serial killer commits murder, they enter a phase where the compulsion temporarily subsides. This period can last days, weeks, months, or even years. During this time, many killers return to seemingly normal lives, going to work, spending time with family, appearing entirely ordinary to those around them. BTK killer Dennis Rader had cooling-off periods that lasted years, sometimes up to 8 years between murders. During these intervals, he was a church president, scout leader, and compliance officer. The length of cooling-off periods often changes as a killer's career progresses. Early on, the periods might be longer as the killer grapples with what they've done, experiences guilt, or fears capture. But over time, these periods typically shorten as the psychological satisfaction from the previous murder fades more quickly. Some killers describe it as an addiction. The high doesn't last as long, and they need another fix sooner. Understanding cooling-off periods helped investigators realize they weren't looking for someone in a constant state of frenzy, but rather someone who could compartmentalize, who might seem completely normal between crimes. This insight was crucial because it meant the killer could be anyone: the friendly neighbor, the helpful coworker, the devoted parent. The cooling-off period also creates a unique investigative challenge. With time passing between murders, physical evidence degrades, witnesses' memories fade, and the connection between crimes becomes harder to establish. Story 7: Geographic Profiling. In the 1990s, a former Vancouver police detective named Kim Rossmo developed a mathematical approach to finding serial killers that would revolutionize investigations. Geographic profiling analyzes the locations of connected crimes to determine the most probable area where an offender lives or works. The method is based on a fascinating principle: serial killers typically operate in areas they know well, but not too close to home. This creates what criminologists call a buffer zone, an area around the killer's residence where they avoid committing crimes to prevent being recognized. Beyond this buffer zone, they have a comfort zone where they're familiar enough with the area to operate efficiently but distant enough to feel safe. Rossmo's algorithm, implemented in specialized software, takes the locations of crime scenes and generates a probability map, with different colors indicating the likelihood of the offender's base. The system considers factors like street layouts, public transportation routes, and geographical barriers like rivers or highways. In one famous case in Louisiana, geographic profiling helped narrow the search area for a serial killer from hundreds of square miles to just a few blocks. The system predicted his home base within a quarter-mile of his actual residence. The technique proved especially valuable when combined with other profiling methods. Psychological profiling suggested what type of person to look for, while geographic profiling suggested where to look. By the early 2000s, police departments worldwide were using this technology, and it expanded beyond serial murder to help investigate serial rape, arson, and even terrorism cases. Story 8: The Signature versus the MO. Understanding the difference between a killer's signature and their modus operandi transformed how investigators linked crimes and predicted behavior. The modus operandi, or MO, is the method a killer uses to accomplish the crime, how they approach victims, what tools they use, how they avoid detection. The MO is practical and evolves over time as the killer learns and adapts. A killer might start by attacking victims on the street but switch to home invasions after a close call with a witness. They might change from using a knife to using a gun, or alter their method of disposal. But the signature is something entirely different. It's the psychological calling card, the aspect of the crime that fulfills the killer's emotional or psychological needs. The signature doesn't evolve, it remains remarkably consistent because it's driven by deep-seated fantasy. When investigators find a signature element, they know they're looking at crimes by the same person. Jack the Ripper's signature involved the specific mutilations he performed, which remained consistent across his attributed murders even as other aspects of the crimes varied. The BTK killer's signature involved binding, torturing, and killing in that specific sequence, which gave him his nickname. Understanding signatures helped solve the case of the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, who left victims in clusters in the woods south of Seattle with rocks placed on top of them, a signature element that appeared across decades. Signatures can include unusual positioning of bodies, items left at scenes, specific words spoken to victims, or particular mutilations. They're so psychologically important to the killer that they take risks to complete them, even when it's not practical for the crime itself. Story 9: Female Serial Killers. While the public imagination typically pictures serial killers as men, female serial killers exist in significant numbers and operate very differently, a fact that has made them historically difficult to detect. Researchers estimate that approximately 10 to 15% of serial killers are women, though they're likely undercounted because their methods often go undetected for longer periods. Female serial killers rarely use hands-on violence like strangulation or stabbing. Instead, roughly 70% use poison, which allows the death to appear natural, especially before modern toxicology testing. Eileen Wuornos, who shot her victims, was actually an anomaly. Most female serial killers favor quieter, less confrontational methods. Their victim selection differs dramatically from male killers too. Women typically kill people they know, family members, patients if they work in healthcare, or people in their care. Janine Jones, a pediatric nurse, killed between 15 and 60 infant patients over several years before suspicion fell on her. The angel of death archetype is particularly common, where nurses or caregivers kill those under their supervision, sometimes claiming they're helping them or playing God. Female serial killers are also more likely to be motivated by financial gain rather than sexual gratification. They might kill multiple husbands for insurance money, elderly patients for inheritance, or children for attention, Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Their crimes can continue for decades before detection. The average female serial killer operates for 8 to 10 years before capture, compared to 4 years for males. This is partly because poison deaths take time to arouse suspicion, especially when victims are already ill or elderly. Story 10: The Zodiac Mystery. Some serial killer cases remain unsolved, becoming legendary mysteries that haunt investigators across generations, and few capture the imagination quite like the Zodiac Killer. Operating in Northern California between 1968 and 1969, the Zodiac definitely killed 5 people and injured 2 others, though he claimed 37 victims in letters to newspapers. What made the Zodiac unique was his deliberate cultivation of media attention through cryptic letters and ciphers. He sent for coded messages to newspapers, taunting police and demanding they publish his letters on front pages, threatening more violence if they didn't comply. The first cipher was cracked within a week by a schoolteacher and his wife, revealing a message about collecting slaves for the afterlife, but subsequent ciphers remained unsolved for decades. In 2020, a team of code breakers finally solved the 340-character cipher using sophisticated computer analysis, revealing a message mocking the police. The Zodiac created a distinctive symbol, a circle with a cross through it, that he used to mark his communications. His crimes showed both organized and disorganized elements, suggesting possible mental deterioration or deliberate misdirection. He called police to report his own crimes, wore an executioner's hood with his symbol on it during one attack, and shot victims with a specific 9mm pistol. After 1969, the letters continued sporadically until 1974, then stopped entirely. Theories about his identity have ranged from known suspects like Arthur Lee Allen to unknown individuals whose DNA was found on envelope flaps. The case remains officially unsolved, with active investigation continuing even now, more than 50 years later. Story 11: The Comfort Zone Theory. Environmental criminology introduced the concept of the comfort zone, fundamentally changing how investigators understood where serial killers operated and why. Every person has mental maps of familiar areas, places they know well from daily routines, past residences, or frequent visits. Serial killers overwhelmingly commit crimes within these comfort zones, areas where they feel confident navigating, know escape routes, and understand normal patterns of activity. Studies have shown that most serial killers commit their first murder within a few miles of their home or workplace. As their confidence grows, the geographic range might expand, but it rarely extends beyond areas they've previously frequented. The Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, operated almost exclusively in areas of northern England where he'd worked as a truck driver, knowing the red light districts, back roads, and industrial areas intimately. This principle helped investigators develop the concept of anchor points, significant locations in a killer's life like current home, childhood home, workplace, or a partner's residence. Crimes tend to cluster around these anchor points in predictable ways. However, the comfort zone isn't simply a circle on a map. It follows transportation routes, respects psychological barriers like bodies of water or distinct neighborhoods, and often has irregular shapes based on the individual's actual movement patterns. Some killers have multiple comfort zones if they've relocated during their criminal career, creating distinct clusters of crimes in different cities or states. Understanding this helped investigators realize that when a series of crimes suddenly appears in a new location, they should look for someone who recently moved there or has existing ties to that area, not a random drifter passing through. Story 12: The Homicidal Triad Debate. For decades, criminologists referenced the McDonald triad, bedwetting, fire setting, and cruelty to animals in childhood as predictors of future violent behavior, but the reality of this theory's validity tells a more complex story. Psychiatrist J.M. MacDonald proposed this triad in 1963 based on his observations of psychiatric patients, and it quickly became accepted wisdom in criminal profiling. The FBI's early interviews with serial killers seemed to support it, with many subjects reporting these childhood behaviors. Bedwetting beyond an appropriate age was thought to indicate problems with control and shame. Fire setting suggested a desire for power and destruction, while cruelty to animals demonstrated an ability to inflict suffering without empathy. However, modern research has significantly challenged the triad's predictive value. Large-scale studies in the 1990s and 2000s found that while some serial killers exhibited these behaviors, so did many people who never became violent criminals. The behaviors appear to be markers of childhood trauma, abuse, or neglect rather than specific predictors of homicidal behavior. What researchers now understand is that these behaviors, when they do appear, are symptoms of deeper problems, disrupted attachment, severe abuse, or neurological issues. Many serial killers did experience severe childhood trauma. Henry Lee Lucas suffered terrible abuse from his mother, Ed Kemper was psychologically tormented by his mother, and Ted Bundy may have been damaged by the shame and confusion of his parentage. But the triad itself isn't a reliable predictor. This evolution in understanding represents an important lesson about criminal psychology. Early theories based on small samples can become accepted wisdom before larger, more rigorous studies test their validity. Story 13: DNA's revolutionary impact. The introduction of DNA profiling in the mid-1980s revolutionized serial killer investigations in ways that transformed both how crimes were solved and how criminals were caught. In 1986, British scientist Alec Jeffreys developed DNA fingerprinting, and the very first use of this technology caught a serial killer. Colin Pitchfork had murdered 2 teenage girls in Leicestershire, England, and another man had confessed to one of the crimes. But DNA testing proved that confessor innocent and instead linked both murders to the same unknown perpetrator. Police conducted a voluntary DNA testing campaign of over 5,000 local men, and Pitchfork was eventually caught when someone revealed he'd convinced a colleague to take the test in his place. This case demonstrated DNA's power not just to identify criminals but to exonerate the innocent. In the United States, DNA databases began forming in the 1990s, with the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, launching nationally in 1998. This system allowed crime scene DNA to be compared against profiles from convicted offenders and other crime scenes. Suddenly, crimes separated by years or geography could be definitively linked. The Golden State Killer case showed DNA's ultimate potential when investigators used genetic genealogy databases in 2018 to identify Joseph DeAngelo, comparing crime scene DNA to distant relatives who'd uploaded their genetic information to ancestry websites. He had committed at least 13 murders and 50 rapes across California from 1974 to 1986, evading capture for decades. DNA has also exonerated dozens of people wrongly convicted of murders later attributed to serial killers, revealing how eyewitness testimony and forensic science from earlier eras sometimes pointed to the wrong person. We've now journeyed through 13 stories, each revealing another layer of how we understand and investigate these complex cases. The science, the psychology, the geography, all pieces of a larger puzzle. Let these tales settle in your mind as you drift deeper into relaxation. 87 more stories await us on this journey through the night. Story 14: The Fantasy Connection. Deep within the psychology of serial killers lies a world of fantasy that often begins years or even decades before the first murder, and understanding this internal landscape became crucial to preventing and solving these crimes. Researchers discovered that most serial killers spend extensive time in violent fantasies before acting on them, sometimes for 10 to 15 years. These fantasies typically begin in adolescence, often triggered by childhood trauma, abuse, or feelings of powerlessness. The fantasies become increasingly elaborate over time, providing emotional satisfaction and a sense of control that the killer's real life lacks. Edmund Kemper, who eventually killed 10 people including his mother, spent years fantasizing about killing before he acted. He would imagine scenarios in detail, how he would approach victims, what he would say, how they would respond. Jeffrey Dahmer described his fantasies as beginning around age 14, involving control and possession of another person. What makes these fantasies particularly dangerous is their progressive nature. They escalate over time, with each imagined scenario becoming more violent and detailed. Eventually, fantasy alone stops providing sufficient satisfaction, and the killer begins testing boundaries, perhaps stalking potential victims, breaking into homes, or committing lesser crimes. This progression from fantasy to action often includes a triggering event, a job loss, relationship failure, or personal humiliation that destabilizes the killer's coping mechanisms. The FBI's research showed that interrupting this fantasy cycle might prevent murders, leading to intervention programs for individuals showing concerning patterns of violent ideation. Understanding the role of fantasy also helped investigators. Many killers kept detailed journals, drawings, or collections that revealed their fantasy worlds, providing crucial evidence and insights into their psychology. Story 15: The Truck Stop Killer Network. The case of the long-haul trucker serial killers revealed a chilling truth about how certain professions create perfect opportunities for serial murder, fundamentally changing how law enforcement monitored certain industries. Long-haul truck drivers travel hundreds of miles daily, crossing multiple jurisdictions, accessing remote locations, and encountering vulnerable victims at truck stops. The FBI estimates that there may be up to 25 to 50 serial killers operating as truck drivers at any given time. Robert Ben Rhodes, known as the Truck Stop Killer, converted his truck's cab into a torture chamber and murdered at least 3 women, though he's suspected in many more deaths. He operated for 15 years before capture in 1990. The challenges in catching these killers are immense. Bodies appear in different states, different jurisdictions investigate in isolation, and the killer has legitimate reasons to be anywhere their crimes occur. Victims are often sex workers, runaways, or hitchhikers whose disappearances might not be immediately reported or investigated with full resources. In 2009, the FBI launched the Highway Serial Killings Initiative, creating a database specifically tracking murders along highway corridors. By 2019, this program had connected over 700 murder victims to potential highway serial killers, with about 400 cases remaining unsolved. The database maps bodies found near highways and truck stops, looking for patterns in timing, location, and victim characteristics. Some killers have been connected to 30 or more murders across decades. This case type demonstrates how serial killers can exploit systematic blind spots in law enforcement, jurisdictional boundaries, transient victims, and the sheer vastness of America's highway system, making detection extraordinarily difficult without specialized national coordination. Story 16: The Hospital Predator Pattern. Healthcare facilities presented unique hunting grounds for serial killers, where the boundary between natural death and murder blurred in deeply disturbing ways that went undetected for years or even decades. Medical professionals have access to vulnerable patients, lethal medications, and an environment where death is expected, creating what criminologists call low accountability settings. Charles Cullen, a nurse, admitted to murdering 40 patients but is suspected in up to 400 deaths across 16 years and 9 hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. He injected patients with digoxin and insulin, causing heart attacks that appeared natural in already ill patients. What's particularly chilling is that Cullen moved from hospital to hospital, and while some institutions suspected problems, they allowed him to resign rather than face investigation, passing the danger to the next employer. Harold Shipman, a British doctor, is believed to have killed between 250 to 400 patients over 23 years, making him possibly the most prolific serial killer in modern history. He used diamorphine injections, forged medical records, and exploited his position of trust so thoroughly that no one questioned the high death rate among his patients until he forged a will to inherit from a victim. The healthcare serial killer typically shows a pattern called the touch of death. Their shifts correlate with suspicious increases in patient mortality. They often start small, perhaps allowing a terminally ill patient to die peacefully, then escalate as they experience feelings of power over life and death. Some claim humanitarian motives, mercy killing, though investigations typically reveal the motivations are more about control and playing God. Detection improved after these cases through better hospital mortality monitoring, mandatory reporting of suspicious deaths, and tracking which staff members were present during unexpected patient deaths. Story 17: Victimology and Vulnerability. Understanding why serial killers choose specific victims, victimology, became one of the most powerful investigative tools, revealing patterns that help both predict and prevent murders. Serial killers overwhelmingly target vulnerable populations, sex workers, runaways, homeless individuals, drug users, and marginalized people whose disappearances might not trigger immediate investigation. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, specifically chose sex workers, stating he knew they wouldn't be missed and police wouldn't prioritize finding them. He was tragically correct for years. His victim count reached 49 confirmed murders, likely 70 or more, over nearly 2 decades. This pattern of targeting vulnerable victims is so common it has a name: the missing, people whose absence goes unreported because they lack stable family connections or community ties. However, victimology goes deeper than just vulnerability. Many serial killers select victims based on specific physical characteristics that connect to their psychological needs. Ted Bundy targeted young women with long dark hair parted in the middle, resembling his college girlfriend who rejected him. The patterns can be incredibly specific: same age range, same hair color, same build, same lifestyle. These similarities help investigators link crimes and understand the killer's psychology. Some killers target victims who represent people in their lives: a mother figure, an authority figure, or an idealized romantic partner. Others choose victims who represent themselves, killing the part of themselves they hate or reject. Understanding victimology also revealed the concept of victim-offender relationship on a spectrum. Some killers knew their victims well, others had brief encounters, and some had no prior contact. Each pattern suggests different hunting grounds, different approaches, and different investigative strategies. High-risk victims in high-risk locations make detection difficult. Low-risk victims in low-risk locations create community alarm that brings resources. Story 18: The Copycat Phenomenon. The media coverage of serial killers created an unintended consequence that investigators had to learn to recognize and address: copycat killers who emulated famous cases, sometimes making attribution difficult. After the Zodiac Killer gained notoriety, numerous copycat letters appeared, some claiming additional murders that investigators could prove were false. The challenge lies in distinguishing genuine communications from imitations, and mistakes can misdirect entire investigations. The internet age amplified this phenomenon exponentially, with detailed information about famous killers' methods, signatures, and crime scenes readily available. Some copycats study famous cases obsessively before beginning their own murder series, incorporating elements they believe made the original killer successful. The most concerning copycats are those who emulate the psychological profile rather than just the methods. Individuals who read about serial killers, identify with them, and decide to pursue their own version of those crimes. After the Columbine school shooting, investigators documented dozens of plots by individuals who specifically referenced and tried to emulate that attack. In serial murder cases, copycat behavior complicates pattern recognition. If a killer mimics another's signature, investigators might incorrectly attribute crimes or miss that they're dealing with multiple perpetrators. However, copycats rarely perfectly replicate signatures because they don't share the psychological needs driving those behaviors. Small differences emerge, variations in the ritual that reveal different underlying fantasies. Some serial killers deliberately changed their methods after police revealed details publicly, trying to throw off investigation. Others added false elements to their crimes to suggest multiple perpetrators. This cat-and-mouse game between investigators and killers, complicated by copycats and media coverage, led to policies about withholding certain crime scene details from public disclosure to maintain investigative advantages. Story 19: The International Cases. Serial murder is not an American phenomenon, though it's often perceived that way, and examining international cases reveals both universal patterns and culturally specific elements of these crimes. Soviet serial killers operated under different constraints than their Western counterparts. Andrei Chikatilo killed at least 52 people in Russia between 1978 and 1990, but Soviet authorities initially denied the existence of serial killers, claiming it was a capitalist phenomenon. This ideological blindness allowed Chikatilo to operate longer than he might have otherwise. He attacked children and young women near railway stations, using the Soviet Union's vast rail network similar to how American killers use highways. When he was finally caught, the investigation had lasted over a decade and involved one of the largest forensic efforts in Russian history. In Colombia, Luis Garavito confessed to murdering 138 boys between 1992 and 1999, though the real number may exceed 300, making him possibly the most prolific serial killer ever documented. He targeted poor and homeless children, often gaining their trust before leading them to remote areas. Cultural factors influenced both his ability to operate undetected. Street children were numerous and largely invisible to authorities, and eventually his sentencing under Colombian law. Harold Shipman in England, as mentioned earlier, used his position as a respected doctor to kill hundreds without suspicion for decades. Japan's demon mama Miyuki Ishikawa killed over 100 infants in the 1940s through her maternity hospital. These international cases show that while the psychology of serial murder appears universal, fantasy, cooling off periods, escalation, the specific manifestations, victim selection, and investigative responses vary significantly based on cultural context, legal systems, and social structures. Story 20: The Investigative Task Force Evolution. When multiple murders clearly connected to one perpetrator terrorize a community, law enforcement forms a task force, and the evolution of these specialized teams transformed how serial killer investigations unfold. Early task forces were often chaotic, multiple agencies working the same case with poor communication, duplicated efforts, and territorial disputes. The Boston Strangler case in the 1960s involved multiple police departments, state police, and the Attorney General's office, often working at cross purposes. Witnesses were interviewed multiple times by different agencies, evidence wasn't shared efficiently, and the investigation became unwieldy. Learning from these early failures, law enforcement developed task force best practices. The Green River Killer Task Force in Seattle pioneered many techniques in the 1980s. They created a centralized database system, established clear leadership hierarchy, rotated assignments to prevent burnout, and integrated experts from various fields. Modern task forces typically include homicide detectives, forensic specialists, profilers, media liaisons, and victim advocates. They establish tip line protocols, as the sheer volume of tips in high-profile cases can overwhelm investigators. The Golden State Killer case generated thousands of tips over 40 years, requiring sophisticated database systems to track and evaluate each one. Task forces also learn to manage psychological toll on investigators. Working serial cases means exposure to horrific crime scenes, intensive work hours, and the pressure of knowing the killer might strike again while they investigate. Rotation policies, mandatory counseling, and clear time limits help preserve investigator mental health. The size of task forces varies. Some involve just a handful of dedicated detectives, while others like the hunt for the BTK killer eventually involved over 100 personnel. The key to success is coordination, communication, and maintaining institutional knowledge even as personnel change over investigations that might span decades. Story 21: Childhood Trauma and the Cycle. Research into serial killer backgrounds revealed disturbing patterns of childhood trauma so consistent that it fundamentally changed theories about what creates these criminals, though the relationship remains more complex than simple cause and effect. Studies examining the backgrounds of convicted serial killers found that somewhere between 70 and 90% experience significant childhood trauma, severe physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, or witnessing extreme violence. Henry Lee Lucas suffered horrific abuse from his mother, who once beat him so severely he was in a coma for 3 days, forced him to watch her have sex with clients, and once killed his pet in front of him. John Wayne Gacy was beaten with a leather strap by his father, who also ridiculed him constantly and accused him of being weak. Edmund Kemper's mother psychologically tortured him, forcing him to live in a locked basement, telling him his thoughts were abnormal, and alternating between seduction and rejection in deeply inappropriate ways. However, millions of children experience trauma without becoming killers, so trauma alone doesn't explain serial murder. The current understanding involves multiple factors converging: genetic predisposition, specific types of trauma during critical developmental periods, lack of protective factors like supportive adults, and neurological differences. Some researchers focus on the age 8 to 12 window, when children develop their identity and moral framework. Trauma during this period, combined with other factors, may be particularly damaging. The attachment theory suggests that failure to form secure attachments in early childhood, especially to maternal figures, prevents development of empathy and creates the emotional detachment necessary for serial killing. Brain imaging studies of serial killers often show abnormalities in areas controlling impulse, emotional regulation, and empathy, though it's unclear whether these are caused by trauma, present from birth, or some combination. 21 stories now rest in your consciousness, each one a piece of the larger puzzle of human behavior at its darkest edges. But even in darkness, we find understanding, prevention, and justice. Breathe deeply and let these narratives guide you gently toward rest. 79 more stories remain in our journey together through this long, quiet night. Story 22, The Mask of Sanity. Perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects of serial killers is their ability to appear completely normal, even charming, to those around them, a phenomenon psychologists call the mask of sanity that challenges our assumptions about recognizing dangerous individuals. Ted Bundy epitomized this quality so perfectly that people who knew him, even after his arrest, struggled to believe he was capable of such crimes. He was articulate, educated, worked at a suicide hotline where he talked people out of ending their lives, and was described as charming and intelligent by almost everyone who met him. Dennis Rader served as a church council president and compliance officer who measured dog waste in people's yards for code violations, the epitome of a mundane, rule-following citizen. John Wayne Gacy performed as Pogo the Clown at children's hospitals and fundraisers, was active in Democratic Party politics, and had his photograph taken with First Lady Rosalind Carter. This ability to maintain a facade of normalcy serves multiple functions for the serial killer. It provides cover for their activities, as suspicion rarely falls on the friendly neighbor or helpful volunteer. It allows them to access victims who might otherwise be wary. Bundy often wore a fake cast and asked young women to help him carry books to his car. The mask also satisfies the killer's ego, as many enjoy the secret knowledge that they're fooling everyone around them. Psychologically, some killers may even believe in their own mask, compartmentalizing so effectively that they separate their normal self from their murderous self. Researchers found that this compartmentalization is sophisticated. Killers maintain jobs requiring trust and responsibility, form relationships, and participate in community life without arousing suspicion. The mask of sanity demonstrates that we cannot identify serial killers by obvious signs or creepy behavior. They hide in plain sight among us, protected by our assumption that monsters should look like monsters. Story 23, The Cooling System Failure. While cooling-off periods are normal for serial killers, some reach a point where the psychological mechanism breaks down entirely, leading to what investigators call acceleration, and understanding this phase becomes critical for prevention. Early in a serial killer's career, cooling-off periods might last months or years. The killer returns to normal life, may experience guilt or fear, and the compulsion remains dormant. But over time, the satisfaction derived from murder diminishes more quickly. Like any addiction, tolerance builds. What once provided emotional release for months might only satisfy for weeks, then days. Jeffrey Dahmer's cooling-off periods progressively shortened over his 13-year killing career. His first murder occurred in 1978, his second not until 1987, 9 years later. But by 1991, he was killing multiple victims per month, sometimes per week. The psychological satisfaction was lasting shorter periods, and the compulsion was intensifying. This acceleration phase is extremely dangerous because the killer is taking greater risks, becoming less careful, and often escalating the violence of their crimes. BTK killer Dennis Rader showed a different pattern, long dormancy periods followed by clusters of murders, suggesting his cooling mechanism was inconsistent rather than progressively failing. Some killers reach a point where they can't stop even when they want to. They describe the compulsion as overwhelming, beyond their conscious control. Edmund Kemper turned himself in partly because he feared his acceleration. He knew he was losing control and would eventually make a fatal mistake or simply never stop. Investigators learned to recognize acceleration patterns in active cases. If murders attributed to the same killer are occurring with increasing frequency, it suggests both that the killer is entering a dangerous phase and that mistakes are more likely, creating opportunities for capture. The acceleration phase often ends in one of three ways: capture due to increased risk-taking, suicide when the killer realizes they can't stop, or a final spectacular crime that the killer intends as their culmination. Story 24 are forensic breakthroughs. The development of forensic science created an arms race between serial killers and investigators, with each advancement in detection leading to changes in criminal behavior and new investigative capabilities. Before fingerprint analysis became routine in the early 1900s, identification of criminals relied on photographs and physical descriptions, imprecise at best. The first use of fingerprints to solve a murder in the Western world occurred in Argentina in 1892, and by the 1920s, fingerprint databases were standard in major police departments. Serial killers adapted, beginning to wear gloves or wipe surfaces. Blood typing emerged in the 1930s, allowing investigators to exclude suspects or include them in smaller groups, though it couldn't provide definitive identification. The luminol test for blood, developed in 1937, revealed cleaned crime scenes and hidden bloodstains invisible to the naked eye, showing investigators exactly what had happened even after extensive cleanup attempts. Hair and fiber analysis advanced through the mid-20th century, allowing microscopic comparisons between evidence and suspects. The fiber evidence was crucial in convicting Wayne Williams in the Atlanta child murders. 28 fiber types found on victims matched materials in his home and car. But the true revolution came with DNA profiling in the 1980s, as discussed earlier, providing identification certainty previously impossible. More recent advances include familial DNA searching, used to catch the Golden State Killer, where partial matches to relatives in databases lead investigators to suspects. Digital forensics now allows recovery of deleted files, internet search histories, and location data from phones, digital breadcrumbs that modern killers leave even when they're physically careful. Israel Keyes, who killed between 2001 and 2012, specifically studied forensics and tried to avoid leaving evidence, burying murder kits in advance, paying cash, and avoiding electronic surveillance. His extreme precautions showed how forensic awareness had changed criminal methodology, though he was ultimately caught through credit card usage and careful detective work. Story 25: The Communication Compulsion. Many serial killers feel compelled to communicate about their crimes, whether through letters to media, calls to police, or other means, a behavior that reveals deep psychological needs and often provides crucial investigative breaks. The Zodiac Killer's letters to newspapers represented perhaps the most famous example, with their cryptographic puzzles and taunting messages. But this communication compulsion appears across many cases and serves multiple psychological functions. For some killers, communication is about recognition. They want credit for their intelligence, their planning, or their success in evading capture. BTK sent letters to police and media after years of silence because he felt he wasn't receiving proper acknowledgement. He provided details only the killer would know, proving his identity, and expressed frustration that he wasn't more famous. The name BTK itself came from his letters, describing his method: bind, torture, kill. Some killers communicate to maintain control over the narrative. They want to shape how their crimes are understood and perceived. Others seem driven by a need for connection, however twisted. Their communications represent engagement with the outside world, breaking the isolation of their secret life. Jack the Ripper's "A Dear Boss" letter coined the nickname that made him infamous, though its authenticity remains debated. The communication compulsion has caught many killers. BTK's re-emergence in 2004 after 25 years of silence led directly to his capture when investigators traced a floppy disk he sent to a church where he served as council president. His need to be recognized and to communicate ultimately overpowered his caution. Police have learned to use this compulsion strategically, sometimes baiting killers with press releases designed to provoke a response. They know that certain types of killers, particularly those with narcissistic traits who crave attention, might reveal themselves through communications. Modern communications include online forums, social media, and digital breadcrumbs that are much easier to trace than anonymous letters, though some killers still seek that connection with investigators or public. Story 26: The Family Annihilator. A distinct category of killer that differs significantly from typical serial killers is the family annihilator, someone who murders their entire family, often including themselves, representing a unique intersection of psychology, social pressure, and violent resolution. Unlike serial killers who kill strangers over extended periods, family annihilators typically kill all at once and are usually motivated by different psychological factors. Research shows these killers are overwhelmingly male, typically family patriarchs, and fall into several categories. The self-righteous annihilator believes the family has disappointed him or threatened his authority, so he destroys them as punishment, like John List, who killed his wife, 3 children, and mother in 1971, then disappeared for 18 years. He claimed he killed them to save their souls because they were drifting from religion. The disappointed annihilator faces financial or personal failure and cannot tolerate the shame of family seeing him fail, so he kills them to protect them from hardship, then often kills himself. The paranoid annihilator believes external forces threaten the family and kills them to save them from perceived dangers. These cases often involve mental illness, delusions, or extreme paranoia. The final category is the spousal revenge annihilator, who kills the family primarily to hurt their partner, making them suffer the ultimate loss, sometimes sparing that partner to live with the grief. Family annihilation cases have increased in periods of economic stress. Spikes occurred during the 2008 recession, suggesting financial pressure triggers some cases. The typical pattern involves a middle-aged man facing job loss, debt, or business failure who can't cope with the shame. Rather than seeking help or accepting reduced circumstances, he decides murder-suicide is preferable. These crimes differ from serial murder psychologically. They're not driven by fantasy or sexual sadism but by a twisted logic of protecting family honor, avoiding shame, or exacting revenge. Prevention is challenging because these men often appear normal, functional, and family-oriented until the moment they snap under accumulated pressure. Story 27: Trophies and Souvenirs. The practice of taking items from victims or crime scenes reveals crucial differences between organized and disorganized killers while providing investigators with both evidence and psychological insights into the offender's motivations. Trophies are items taken to prove accomplishment and allow the killer to relive the crime: jewelry, identification cards, photographs, or clothing that remind them of the victim and the murder. Jeffrey Dahmer kept photographs of victims at various stages of his crimes, skulls, and other body parts, wanting physical proof of his acts and objects to revisit his fantasies. Dennis Rader kept extensive records including drawings, photographs, and personal items from victims, creating elaborate files he reviewed repeatedly. The psychological function of trophies is memory reinforcement. The killer can hold an object and relive the emotional and psychological experience of the murder, extending satisfaction beyond the actual event. Some killers create shrines with these items, displaying them privately where they can view them regularly. This behavior is so common that when police search a suspect's residence in serial murder cases, they specifically look for collections of items that might link to victims. The discovery of such items can provide definitive proof of guilt and link the suspect to additional unsolved cases. Souvenirs differ slightly from trophies in that they're more personal to the victim, items that don't prove the kill but represent the person. A diary, a favorite piece of jewelry, or something that helps the killer feel possession of the victim's identity. Some killers give souvenirs to people in their lives. John Wayne Gacy gave jewelry belonging to victims to employees and associates, a behavior both unbelievably bold and psychologically revealing about his compartmentalization. The organized killer carefully preserves trophies and may have elaborate storage systems, while disorganized killers might keep items haphazardly or not at all. Understanding trophy behavior helps investigators. If victims' personal items are missing, it suggests an organized killer who's likely kept them, meaning a search warrant for the right suspect's home might yield substantial evidence connecting them to multiple crimes. Story 28: The medical examiner's role. Medical examiners and forensic pathologists serve as crucial investigators in serial murder cases, finding evidence on bodies that other investigators might miss and establishing cause, manner, and time of death with scientific precision. Each body tells a story through injury patterns, trace evidence, and post-mortem changes that skilled pathologists can read. In serial cases, the medical examiner might be the first person to recognize that multiple deaths are connected. They notice similar injury patterns, unusual cause of death details, or staging elements that suggest the same perpetrator. Dr. Thomas Nogu, the famous Los Angeles County coroner, handled numerous high-profile cases and understood that his careful documentation might be crucial evidence years later. Medical examiners document everything: every bruise, cut, and abrasion, their size, shape, location, and characteristics. In serial cases, these details help establish signature elements. If 3 bodies show distinctive ligature marks with identical knot patterns, that suggests one killer. If victims all show evidence of specific drugs or poisons, that's a connection. The medical examiner also preserves evidence that investigators might not know is relevant until much later. They collect fingernail scrapings that might contain attacker DNA, save clothing that might have trace evidence, and preserve samples of hair, blood, and tissue. In the Green River Killer case, bodies were examined and evidence preserved in the 1980s, but DNA technology didn't exist yet to analyze it. When Gary Ridgway was finally caught in 2001, the carefully preserved evidence from victims killed 20 years earlier provided the proof to convict him. Medical examiners also determine time since death using multiple indicators: body temperature, rigor mortis, lividity, decomposition state, insect activity, and stomach contents. This timeline helps investigators establish suspect alibis and connect the victim's last known movements to the murder. In cases with badly decomposed bodies, forensic anthropologists work with medical examiners to identify victims through skeletal remains, dental records, and DNA when soft tissue is gone. The medical examiner's testimony in court translates physical evidence into language juries can understand, explaining how injuries were inflicted and whether they match the prosecution's theory of events. Story 29: The Power of Control Dynamic. At the core of most serial murder lies a fundamental drive for power and control. Understanding this motivation transformed how investigators interpreted crime scenes and predicted future behavior. Unlike popular portrayals that emphasize sexual sadism or insanity, most serial killers are motivated primarily by the desire to dominate another human being completely. Dennis Rader explicitly stated that BTK stood for his process: bind, torture, kill, each step representing increasing levels of control over his victims. He described the binding as crucial because it rendered victims completely helpless, giving him total power over their lives. This power motivation explains many aspects of serial killer behavior that otherwise seem puzzling. Why do some killers spend hours with victims before killing them? Because the prolonged control period is psychologically more important than the murder itself. Edmund Kemper would sometimes drive around with victims for hours, having conversations while they were still alive, exercising complete power over whether they lived or died in that moment. Jeffrey Dahmer's attempts to create zombies through lobotomy-style procedures on living victims represented the ultimate control fantasy: a person who would remain alive but completely submissive to his will. The power motivation explains victim selection too. Most serial killers choose victims they can easily overpower: women, children, elderly people, or those incapacitated by drugs or alcohol. They avoid victims who might fight effectively or overpower them. The fantasy is about dominance, not fair combat. Some killers escalate from peeping, stalking, and burglary, crimes involving power over others without their knowledge, to rape, and finally to murder as they seek deeper levels of control. The power motivation also explains why some killers keep victims alive for extended periods. Gary Heidnik kept women imprisoned in his basement, and Ariel Castro held 3 women captive for years. The ongoing control provided continuous psychological satisfaction that a quick murder wouldn't. Understanding the power dynamic helped investigators predict escalation patterns and identify potential suspects among those with histories of controlling behavior, domestic violence, or other crimes involving domination of others. We've traveled through 29 stories now, each one illuminating another aspect of these dark investigations. The science behind the detection, the psychology beneath the crimes, the dedicated work of those who pursue justice. Let these narratives wash over you like gentle waves as you sink deeper into peaceful rest. 71 more stories await us as the night continues its quiet embrace. Story 30: The Staging Phenomenon. Crime scene staging, when a killer deliberately alters a scene to mislead investigators, reveals sophisticated criminal thinking and creates unique investigative challenges that require careful forensic analysis to unravel. Staging occurs in roughly 3% of homicides but appears more frequently in serial cases where killers are experienced and intelligent enough to understand investigative procedures. The staging can take many forms. Some killers arrange bodies in specific positions to convey messages or create tableaus that fulfill fantasy elements. This differs from true staging because it serves the killer's psychological needs rather than purely deceptive purposes. The Zodiac Killer staged some crime scenes to appear as Lover's Lane robberies gone wrong, attempting to obscure his actual motivations. True staging aims to misdirect investigation, making a murder look like suicide, accident, or natural death. Experts identify staging through inconsistencies between physical evidence and the presented scene. Blood spatter patterns might contradict the supposed sequence of events, or weapon placement might be impossible given the wounds. Medical examiners often detect staging first. Suicide staging is particularly common, but pathologists recognize when wound characteristics or body positioning are incompatible with self-infliction. Some serial killers stage early crimes to avoid detection, then abandon staging once they realize they're not being connected across jurisdictions. Others maintain elaborate staging throughout their careers. Staging can also involve introducing false evidence, planting items to implicate others, or creating false trails. Danny Rowling, the Gainesville Ripper, posed victims in sexually degrading positions, partially as staging to suggest a different type of offender and partially to fulfill his own psychological needs. Investigators learn to distinguish between staging and personation. Personation is when killers try to make their crimes look like another serial killer's work, hoping to benefit from investigative confusion. The key to detecting staging lies in the details, small inconsistencies that reveal the scene's artificiality, and experienced homicide investigators develop almost intuitive recognition of scenes that feel wrong, prompting deeper forensic examination. Story 31: The Decline and Capture. Most serial killers eventually make mistakes as their mental state deteriorates, their compulsion overwhelms their caution, or investigative pressure mounts. Understanding this decline phase helps explain how these criminals are finally caught. The factors contributing to capture vary widely but often involve escalating risk-taking during the acceleration phase discussed earlier. Ted Bundy's final capture came after a traffic stop where a police officer noticed his suspicious behavior and discovered burglary tools in his car, a routine interaction he would have avoided earlier in his career when he was more careful. Dennis Rader's downfall came through technological ignorance. He sent a floppy disk to police, asking if they could trace it back to him, and when police lied and said no, he believed them. Metadata on the disk led directly to his church computer and his identity. Some killers deteriorate psychologically, becoming increasingly unstable. Richard Chase, the vampire killer of Sacramento, was so mentally ill by the time of his crimes that he left overwhelming evidence and made no attempt at concealment. His capture came within days. Others are caught through dogged traditional police work. Gary Ridgway was interviewed multiple times during the Green River investigation before DNA technology finally proved his guilt 20 years after his first murders. The role of luck or chance cannot be dismissed either. Many captures involve fortunate coincidences. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam Killer, was caught because a witness saw police issuing parking tickets near a crime scene and later remembered a man hurrying to a car with a parking ticket on it. That single detail led to his identification. Some killers grow tired and want to be caught, turning themselves in or deliberately leaving clues. Edmund Kemper called police from a payphone and confessed, then waited for them to arrive. He later explained he couldn't stop himself and feared continuing. Capture patterns reveal that despite their intelligence and planning, serial killers are still human and make human errors. They get overconfident, they misjudge technology, they fail to account for chance witnesses, or they simply deteriorate under the psychological weight of their crimes. Story 32: The Interview Dynamics. When serial killers are captured, the interview process becomes crucial. How investigators extract confessions, details, and information about additional victims requires specialized techniques that took decades to develop and refine. Traditional interrogation methods often fail with serial killers who have practiced deception, compartmentalization, and manipulation for years. The Reed technique, commonly used for criminal interrogation, emphasizes accusation and psychological pressure to break down denials. But serial killers often respond better to approaches that appeal to their ego and need for recognition. Special Agent John Douglas pioneered interview techniques specifically for serial killers during his work with the Behavioral Science Unit. He learned to stroke their egos, express interest in understanding them, and position the interview as a collaboration rather than confrontation. Edmund Kemper responded to this approach, speaking for hours about his crimes, psychology, and motivations because he enjoyed being taken seriously and analyzed. The interview approach must match the killer's psychology. Narcissistic killers like Dennis Rader respond to flattery and recognition of their intelligence. Organized killers like Ted Bundy often want to demonstrate their superiority and will discuss crimes in theoretical terms before gradually admitting personal involvement. Some killers are willing to provide information about additional victims if treated with respect and if they believe they can control some aspect of their fate. Gary Ridgway confessed to dozens of previously unknown murders in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The physical setting matters too. Interviews conducted in neutral settings rather than harsh interrogation rooms often yield better results. Building rapport over multiple sessions allows killers to gradually open up. Some investigators spend dozens of hours across many sessions before a killer fully confesses. The goal is not just confession but detailed information, locations of undiscovered bodies, identities of unknown victims, and details that provide closure for families. Modern interview techniques also involve strategic disclosure, revealing certain evidence to gauge reactions while withholding other details to verify later confessions are genuine rather than false admissions. Story 33: The Victim Impact. Behind every serial killer case stand numerous victims and families whose lives were forever shattered. Understanding the victim impact dimension reveals the true human cost of these crimes beyond statistics and case files. Each victim represents not just a life ended but networks of relationships destroyed, parents who lose children, children who lose parents, siblings, friends, and communities all affected by the trauma. The families of serial killer victims face unique challenges beyond typical homicide survivors. Many endure years of uncertainty before their loved one's body is found or the case is solved. The Green River Killer case left families in anguished limbo for 2 decades, not knowing if their daughters and sisters were dead or alive, unable to grieve or find closure. When killers target vulnerable populations like sex workers, families sometimes face additional pain from public and media attitudes that implicitly suggest the victims were somehow less valuable. Advocates have fought to ensure all victims receive equal investigation regardless of lifestyle. The victim impact extends to communities. When serial killers operate in specific areas, entire populations live in fear. During the Atlanta child murders in 1979 to 1981, the African American community lived in terror as children continued disappearing. Parents kept children inside, changed routines, and the psychological toll affected thousands. Some victims survive serial killer attacks, living with physical and psychological trauma. These survivors often provide crucial testimony that helps convict killers and warn others. Their recovery journeys involve processing not just their personal trauma but the knowledge of what the killer did to others. Victim advocacy has evolved significantly through serial killer cases. Support groups specifically for families of serial killer victims provide specialized help for their unique situation. These families often form bonds, supporting each other through trials that can last years and dealing with media attention that invades their privacy. Many families channel their grief into advocacy, pushing for legal changes, supporting law enforcement, or creating foundations in their loved ones' names. They work to ensure victims are remembered as the people they were, not reduced to statistics or defined solely by how they died. Story 34: The Media's Complex Role. The relationship between serial killers and media creates a complicated dynamic that has evolved significantly over decades, from sensationalist coverage that arguably inspired copycat crimes to more responsible reporting that balances public interest with ethical considerations. Early media coverage of serial killers was often lurid and sensationalist, with newspapers competing for readers through shocking details and dramatic headlines. Jack the Ripper became legendary partly due to extensive newspaper coverage that created public panic and fascination. The Zodiac Killer deliberately cultivated media attention, sending letters to newspapers and demanding publication on front pages. Media complied, arguably giving him exactly what he wanted: fame and power over public discourse. By the 1970s and 1980s, serial killers had become media phenomena. Ted Bundy's trials were televised, and he became a celebrity of sorts: charismatic, intelligent, articulate. This coverage concerned experts who worried it glamorized serial killers and inspired potential copycat offenders. The term serial killer itself entered public consciousness through media coverage, making these criminals a cultural category. Media coverage serves legitimate purposes, warning communities about active threats, generating tips from the public, and applying pressure to solve cold cases. The television show America's Most Wanted led to numerous captures, including several serial killers, by broadcasting information to millions of viewers. However, media also creates problems. Extensive coverage reveals investigative details that help killers understand what police know and adjust their methods. It can traumatize victims' families who see their loved ones' death sensationalized. It provides the attention and notoriety many killers crave, potentially feeding their egos or inspiring others. Modern media ethics have evolved to focus less on killers' identities and more on victims. Many outlets now refuse to use killers' names or photographs, instead emphasizing victims. The FBI recommends limited media coverage of certain details to protect investigative integrity. Social media created new challenges. Online communities sometimes glorify serial killers, creating fan pages and romantic narratives around them. This phenomenon, while involving a small minority, disturbs experts who see it as cultural sickness that treats murderers as anti-heroes rather than criminals. Story 35: The Adolescent Onset. While most serial killers commit their first murders as adults, understanding the adolescent development of these individuals provides crucial insights into prevention and early intervention possibilities. The typical serial killer shows concerning behavior patterns during adolescence: violence toward animals, escalating aggression toward peers, fire setting, and early sexual offenses. These behaviors represent testing boundaries and experimenting with power and control. Edmund Kemper killed his grandparents at age 15, his first murders that would be followed by many more after his release from psychiatric custody at age 21. During adolescence, future serial killers often experience social isolation, struggle with sexuality or gender identity in unhealthy ways, and develop elaborate violent fantasies. The fantasies typically begin around ages 12 to 14 and become increasingly detailed and consuming over subsequent years. Some researchers focus on adolescent brain development. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning, doesn't fully develop until the mid-20s. Individuals with both neurological abnormalities and severe environmental stressors during this critical period may develop the disordered thinking associated with serial murder. The question of whether intervention during adolescence could prevent future serial murders remains contentious. Some juvenile offenders who showed extreme warning signs, like Mary Bell, who killed 2 toddlers at age 10 in England, were treated and apparently rehabilitated. Others, like Kemper, were released from juvenile facilities and went on to kill. The challenge lies in distinguishing adolescents who will become dangerous adults from those displaying concerning behaviors due to typical adolescent turmoil, mental illness, or abuse who will not become killers. Thousands of troubled adolescents exist for every one who becomes a serial killer, making prediction extremely difficult. However, certain patterns warrant serious intervention: adolescent sexual sadism, extreme violence toward vulnerable beings, complete lack of empathy or remorse, and persistent violent fantasies combined with planning behaviors. Modern intervention programs focus on intensive therapy, family counseling, and close monitoring for high-risk youth, though measuring success is difficult given the rarity of serial murder overall. Story 36: The Investigative Dead Ends. Serial killer investigations inevitably encounter dead ends, false leads, and periods of frustration that test investigators' persistence. Understanding how successful cases eventually broke through these obstacles reveals the importance of dedication and new approaches. The Green River Killer investigation spanned nearly 20 years with numerous dead ends. Thousands of tips were investigated, hundreds of suspects were interviewed, and multiple people were seriously considered as the killer before Gary Ridgway was finally identified through DNA. During those 2 decades, investigators faced budget cuts, public criticism, and the psychological toll of working an unsolved case with bodies continuing to appear. The Zodiac case represents the ultimate investigative frustration. Despite massive effort, millions of dollars spent, thousands of suspects investigated, and continuing work spanning 50-plus years, the case remains officially unsolved. Investigators followed countless leads that seemed promising but ultimately went nowhere. Arthur Lee Allen was suspected for years, but evidence never definitely connected him despite circumstantial factors. False confessions plague serial killer investigations. The more publicity a case receives, the more people confess falsely. Investigators must spend valuable time ruling out these false confessors while worrying they might miss the real killer among them. The BTK case went cold for decades after Rader stopped killing and communicating in the late 1970s. The task force eventually disbanded, the case files were boxed, and it became a cold case until Rader's need for attention brought him back in 2004. That 25-year gap represented a massive dead end, no new evidence, no new leads, just frustration. Many cases are solved only when new technology emerges. DNA solved the Golden State Killer case after 40 years, and familial DNA searching opened new possibilities for other cold cases. But until those breakthroughs, investigators face dead ends with no clear path forward. Some investigators work serial cases their entire careers without solving them, a profound professional and personal frustration. Yet they persist because families deserve answers and communities deserve safety, demonstrating remarkable dedication in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Story 37: The Psychological Autopsy. When serial killers die, whether through suicide, execution, or natural causes, before revealing all their victims or motivations, investigators sometimes perform psychological autopsies, attempting to understand the killer's mind and potentially locate additional victims. A psychological autopsy involves analyzing everything known about the person: childhood records, school reports, employment history, medical and psychiatric records, interviews with people who knew them, and detailed analysis of their crimes. The goal is to create a comprehensive psychological profile that might reveal patterns investigators missed. After Ted Bundy's execution in 1989, investigators continued working to identify all his victims. He had confessed to 30 murders but hinted at more, playing games with investigators until the end. Psychological autopsy work on his patterns, preferences, and travel records has helped identify possible additional victims in the decades since. When David Parker Ray, the toy box killer, died in prison before trial, investigators faced the challenge of determining how many victims he had killed. He kept extensive journals and recordings detailing torture of victims, but bodies were never found. Psychological autopsy of his writings, combined with missing persons reports and his known movements, helped investigators estimate victim numbers and provide some closure to families. The technique is also used to understand motivation when killers never fully explain themselves. Jeffrey Dahmer was extensively interviewed before his death in prison, but psychological analysis of his entire life, crimes, and statements continues to this day, helping researchers understand the specific pathology he represented. Some killers leave behind manifesto-type writings discovered after death that provide insights into their thinking. Others leave nothing, forcing investigators to piece together psychology from crime scene analysis and victimology alone. Psychological autopsies have limitations: they're interpretive, based on available information, and can't be verified by speaking with the subject. Yet they serve important functions, helping investigators locate additional victims, providing closure to families, advancing criminal psychology understanding, and potentially preventing future crimes by identifying warning signs earlier. 37 stories have now passed through our journey together, each one a thread in the complex tapestry of criminal investigation and human psychology. As these narratives settle into your consciousness, feel yourself drifting deeper into restful sleep. The night stretches peacefully ahead, with 63 more stories waiting to accompany you through the quiet hours. Rest now, let your breathing slow, and continue this gentle journey into sleep. Story 38: The Signature Evolution Myth. While criminal profiling teaches that signatures remain constant because they fulfill deep psychological needs, closer examination of long-term serial killer careers reveals that signatures can subtly evolve, challenging investigators' assumptions about case linkage. The fundamental elements of a signature typically remain stable. If a killer derives satisfaction from a specific type of control or ritual, that core need persists. However, the expression of that need may refine over time as the killer learns what provides maximum satisfaction. Dennis Rader's BTK signature remained binding, torturing, and killing, but his specific techniques evolved as he discovered what worked best for his psychological needs. Early crimes were somewhat disorganized and experimental, later crimes showed refinement and increased ritual elements. Some killers add elements to their signature over time, layering new rituals onto existing ones as their fantasies develop greater complexity. Others simplify, stripping away elements they discover aren't psychologically necessary. The challenge for investigators lies in recognizing when variations represent signature evolution versus different offenders. If ligature marks appear similar but not identical across murders, does that indicate one killer refining technique or multiple killers? Advances in behavioral analysis now account for signature evolution, particularly in cases spanning many years. Investigators look for core consistent elements beneath surface variations. The Golden State Killer's crimes showed significant evolution, from burglary to rape to murder, but underlying patterns of control, planning, and victim selection remained consistent enough to eventually recognize one offender across the crime series. Story 39: The Team Killer Phenomenon. While most serial killers operate alone, some form partnerships that create unique dynamics and often accelerate the violence, presenting distinct investigative challenges. Team killers typically involve dominant and submissive partners, with one person driving the crimes and another participating through psychological manipulation, shared fantasy, or fear. The Hillside Stranglers, cousins Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, murdered 10 young women in Los Angeles in 1977 to 1978, with the dominant Buono controlling the younger Bianchi. Their partnership ended after a conflict, and Bianchi later attempted solo murders that led to both their captures. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng created a torture compound in rural California where they kidnapped, tortured, and killed an estimated 11 to 25 victims in the mid-1980s. Lake was the mastermind with the developed fantasy. Ng was drawn into participation. When Lake committed suicide after capture, Ng fought extradition for years, demonstrating how team dynamics can complicate legal proceedings. Some team killers involve romantic couples. Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo raped and murdered teenage girls in Canada, including Homolka's younger sister, in the early 1990s. Their case revealed how one partner, usually female, might participate in extreme violence they likely wouldn't commit alone. Team dynamics often accelerate violence because partners encourage each other and feel less individual responsibility. The presence of another person can also overcome last-minute hesitation that might stop a solo killer. Team killers are often caught more quickly than solo operators because two people create twice the evidence, twice the potential witnesses, and twice the risk that one will eventually talk or turn on the other. Story 40: The Cooling-off Geography. Where serial killers spend their cooling-off periods reveals important patterns about their psychology and provides investigative opportunities often overlooked in favor of focusing on crime scenes themselves. Most killers return to completely normal routines during cooling-off periods. They go to work, spend time with family, engage in hobbies, and present no obvious signs of having recently committed murder. Dennis Rader attended church, coached youth activities, and performed his compliance officer job during cooling-off periods spanning years. Understanding this normalcy is crucial because it means surveillance of suspects during inactive periods rarely yields suspicious behavior. However, some killers engage in specific activities during cooling-off periods that serve as substitutes for the actual crime. They might visit prostitutes, view violent pornography, or engage in lesser offenses like burglary or voyeurism. These substitute activities provide diminished satisfaction that delays but doesn't prevent the next murder. Investigators learn to examine suspects' activities during cooling-off periods for these escalating substitute behaviors. Some killers relocate during cooling-off periods, creating geographic clusters of crimes separated by years and distance. When investigators map these patterns, they often find the killer has legitimate reasons for being in different areas: military deployment, job transfers, or family moves. Understanding cooling-off geography helps cold case investigators identify potential suspects who were present during crime clusters but absent during gaps. Story 41: The False Confession Problem. Serial killer cases attract false confessions at alarming rates, creating serious investigative obstacles that waste resources and sometimes lead to wrongful convictions that allow real killers to continue operating. High-profile cases generate dozens or even hundreds of false confessions from people motivated by mental illness, desire for attention, guilt over unrelated matters, or strange psychological needs to be associated with notorious crimes. The Black Dahlia murder in 1947 Los Angeles generated over 50 false confessions, none credible. Investigators must carefully evaluate each confession, looking for details only the real killer would know, information deliberately withheld from public disclosure. The Zodiac case has seen hundreds of people confess or be accused over decades, exhausting investigative resources. Some false confessors are remarkably convincing, having researched cases extensively or incorporated publicly known details into elaborate false narratives. Henry Lee Lucas confessed to over 600 murders across the United States, and authorities initially believed him, closing cases based on his confessions. Later investigation revealed he couldn't have committed most of them, he was in other states or even in prison during many murders he described. Lucas appeared to have memorized case details from investigators' questions and crime scene photos, then regurgitated information back as confession. The scandal revealed how investigators, desperate to solve cases, sometimes unconsciously fed information to confessors or interpreted ambiguous statements as confession. Modern interrogation protocols specifically address false confession risks, particularly with vulnerable populations like juveniles or mentally ill individuals. Investigators now carefully document what information suspects possessed before confessing versus what they learned during questioning. Video recording all interrogations helps distinguish genuine knowledge from contaminated confession. Story 42: The Digital Footprint Era. Modern serial killers leave digital footprints that their predecessors never faced: internet searches, cell phone location data, electronic communications, and social media activity that create unprecedented investigative opportunities while also changing how killers operate. Israel Keyes, who killed from 2001 to 2012, specifically studied digital forensics and tried to avoid electronic surveillance. He paid cash, turned off his cell phone during crimes, avoided security cameras, and buried murder kits in advance to avoid retail records of weapon purchases. Despite extreme precautions, he was ultimately caught through ATM usage of a victim's card and surveillance footage. His case demonstrated both how digital awareness changes criminal methodology and how difficult avoiding all digital traces has become. Modern investigations routinely examine suspects' internet search histories, finding queries about forensics, body disposal, specific victims, or crime locations. Web browsing patterns often reveal fantasy development, searches for violent pornography, torture methods, or information about previous serial killers. Social media provides evidence of stalking behavior, connections to victims, and sometimes killers' own documentation of their crimes or hints about them. Cell phone location data places suspects at crime scenes with precision impossible in earlier eras. Phones ping cell towers, creating movement records that can confirm or destroy alibis. The Golden State Killer investigation used partial DNA matches from genealogy websites, a technique unimaginable before the digital era. Suspects' relatives uploaded DNA to ancestry sites, and investigators identified family trees leading to Joseph DeAngelo. This breakthrough opened possibilities for solving countless cold cases but also raised privacy concerns. Digital evidence is now so central that some investigators focus more on electronic forensics than traditional physical evidence, though the best investigations combine both approaches. Story 43: The Survivor Testimony. Serial killer survivors who escape or are released provide uniquely valuable testimony that helps catch killers, understand their methods, and sometimes prevent additional murders, though they carry profound trauma from their experiences. Carol D'Aronch escaped Ted Bundy in 1974 when he attempted to abduct her, and her testimony about his appearance, vehicle, and methods helped connect multiple cases and eventually contributed to his conviction. Her survival came from fighting back when Bundy attempted to handcuff her, demonstrating that resistance sometimes succeeds even against experienced killers. Rhonda Stapley survived an encounter with Bundy by jumping from his moving car and escaping into darkness, though she didn't report it for years due to trauma and fear of not being believed. Tracy Edwards escaped from Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment and flagged down police, leading to Dahmer's immediate capture and likely preventing additional murders. Edwards noticed the handcuffs, the strange smell, and Dahmer's increasingly agitated behavior, trusted his instincts, and made his escape at a critical moment. Survivors often describe similar patterns: the killer seemed normal initially, turned controlling gradually, and there was a specific moment when they realized extreme danger and acted. Some survivors suffer guilt over living when others died, wondering what they might have done differently or whether their testimony earlier could have prevented later murders. Many participate in catching and convicting their attackers despite the trauma of testifying, facing the killer in court, and publicly discussing their victimization. Survivor accounts help investigators understand the killer's approach methods, what they say to victims, how they establish control, and what breaks in procedure or luck allow escape. Story 44: The Execution Debates. Serial killer cases raise profound questions about capital punishment. Supporters argue these crimes represent exactly why death penalty exists, while opponents note wrongful convictions, unequal application, and whether execution provides real justice or closure. Ted Bundy's execution in 1989 drew crowds celebrating outside the prison, with vendors selling shirts reading "Burn Bundy Burn." His death was seen by many as appropriate justice for his numerous murders. However, his execution also ended any possibility of identifying additional victims or understanding his psychology more fully. John Wayne Gacy was executed in 1994 after 14 years on death row, during which he gave numerous interviews, created artwork, and continued denying aspects of his crimes. His execution provided some closure for victims' families, though opinions varied even among them about whether death was appropriate or merely released him from the consequences of living with his crimes. Eileen Wuornos was executed in 2002 after deteriorating mentally in prison, raising questions about executing the mentally ill. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, avoided execution by confessing to dozens of murders and providing body locations, demonstrating how death penalty's existence can be leveraged to solve cases and provide closure. Some families prefer life imprisonment, believing execution is too easy an escape and preferring the killer live with consequences. The debate over executing serial killers involves weighing retribution versus information, closure versus cost, and certainty of guilt given several death row exonerations. Through DNA evidence. Most modern serial killers receive life sentences without parole rather than death sentences, partly due to the lengthy and expensive appeals process and partly due to changing attitudes about capital punishment. Story 45: The Mythology versus Reality. Popular culture created a mythology around serial killers that often diverges significantly from reality, affecting public perception, investigation, and even how killers view themselves. Movies and television often portray serial killers as brilliant, charming masterminds who taunt police and operate with near-supernatural elusiveness. While some killers like Ted Bundy fit aspects of this profile, most are average or below-average intelligence, caught through routine police work rather than elaborate profiling. The evil genius narrative flatters killers' egos and potentially inspires copycats who identify with glamorized fictional versions. The myth that serial killers are primarily motivated by sexual sadism overlooks that many are driven by power, control, profit, or other motivations. Female serial killers especially diverge from the mythology, typically using poison rather than hands-on violence and motivated by financial gain more than sexual gratification. Popular culture suggests serial killers are obvious loners, but most maintain jobs, relationships, and community involvement, successfully masking their crimes behind normalcy. The mythology of the signature has become so culturally embedded that some killers deliberately create signatures they believe investigators expect, performing behaviors more from cultural scripts than genuine psychological need. Some killers consume media about serial killers and pattern their crimes after those they've studied, creating a feedback loop between culture and crime. The mythology also affects victims. People believe they'd recognize danger, but killers' apparent normalcy is precisely what makes them dangerous. Understanding the gap between mythology and reality improves both investigation and prevention. Story 46: The Childhood Warning Signs. Identifying genuine warning signs in childhood that predict serial killing remains controversial. While patterns exist, they also appear in many children who never become violent, creating ethical dilemmas about intervention. The problematic behaviors most commonly cited include extreme cruelty to animals, fire setting with fascination rather than accident, and persistent bedwetting beyond appropriate age, though as discussed earlier, this triad has limited predictive value. More reliable indicators include combination of multiple factors: severe abuse, neurological problems, lack of empathy, persistent violent fantasies, escalating behavioral problems, and social isolation. Jeffrey Dahmer showed many signs. He collected roadkill to dissect, was withdrawn, began drinking heavily in adolescence, and exhibited concerning sexual behaviors. However, these signs weren't recognized or addressed adequately at the time. Albert Fish showed extreme warning signs as a child. He had disturbing sexual fantasies, hurt himself and others, and exhibited bizarre behaviors, but grew up in an era when such children received brutal institutional treatment rather than therapy. Modern understanding emphasizes that childhood trauma, particularly attachment disruption and abuse during critical developmental periods, combined with possible genetic predisposition, creates risk. But millions of children experience trauma without becoming killers, so the challenge lies in identifying which troubled children need intervention versus which will naturally develop healthy coping mechanisms. Ethical concerns arise around labeling children as potential killers based on behavioral patterns. Such labels could become self-fulfilling prophecies or stigmatize children who simply need support. Current approaches focus on treating childhood trauma, teaching empathy and emotional regulation, and monitoring concerning behavior without deterministic predictions. Story 47: The Cold Case Revolution. Advances in technology and dedicated cold case units have revolutionized investigations of decades-old serial murders, bringing justice when families had lost hope and demonstrating that these cases are never truly closed. DNA technology is the primary breakthrough. Evidence preserved from crime scenes in the 1970s and 1980s, before DNA analysis existed, can now be tested and compared against databases. The Golden State Killer case exemplifies this. Evidence collected in the late 1970s provided the DNA that identified Joseph DeAngelo in 2018 through genealogical databases, 40 years after his last known crime. Cold case investigators approach old murders with fresh eyes and new tools, often finding leads previous investigators missed or couldn't pursue with available technology. The formation of dedicated cold case units ensures these investigations receive focused attention rather than being perpetually back-burner cases. Some departments specifically target serial cases, recognizing that solving one often solves multiple murders. Publicity about cold cases generates new tips. Witnesses who were too afraid to come forward decades ago might feel safer now, or people who were children during the crimes now have adult perspective on what they saw. The challenge in cold cases includes degraded evidence, deceased witnesses, and investigators who've retired or died, taking institutional knowledge with them. However, modern database systems that connect crimes across jurisdictions help identify patterns missed when cases were investigated in isolation. Some serial killers who thought they'd escaped justice decades ago now face arrest and prosecution, demonstrating to active serial killers that time doesn't guarantee safety from capture. 47 stories have carried you through the night, each one a careful examination of darkness and the light of justice that follows. Let these narratives continue to drift through your consciousness as you sink into deeper rest. Your breathing slows, your body relaxes completely, and 53 more stories await to guide you through the peaceful hours ahead. Sleep now, and let the journey continue. Story 48: The Ritualistic Patterns. Deep within the psychology of certain serial killers lies an almost ceremonial approach to murder, where specific rituals must be performed in precise order to satisfy psychological needs that go beyond the act of killing itself. These ritualistic patterns differ from signatures in their rigidity. The killer feels compelled to complete every step exactly, and deviation causes psychological distress that diminishes satisfaction. Danny Rowling, the Gainesville Ripper, followed elaborate rituals in his 5 murders in 1990, positioning bodies in specific ways, cleaning them, and arranging the crime scenes like theatrical stages. His rituals served multiple purposes. They fulfilled fantasy requirements developed over years, demonstrated his control over the victims even after death, and created the scene he'd imagined countless times. Ritualistic killers often describe feeling incomplete if circumstances prevent them from finishing their ritual. If interrupted or forced to flee before completing their ceremony, they experience frustration that can accelerate the need for the next murder. Understanding ritualistic patterns helps investigators in several ways. First, incomplete rituals at crime scenes might indicate the killer was interrupted, suggesting witnesses exist who saw something unusual even if they didn't. Recognize its significance. Second, rituals often require time and privacy, helping narrow location types where killers operate. Third, the specific elements of rituals reveal deep psychological needs that profiling can interpret. Some rituals involve religious or pseudo-religious elements, others are sexual, and some seem to recreate or reverse childhood traumas. The consistency of rituals across multiple crime scenes provides definitive linkage evidence. When investigators see identical unusual behaviors at separate murders, they know they're pursuing one killer rather than multiple offenders with similar general patterns. Story 49, The Interstate Nightmare. Before modern databases and communication systems, serial killers who crossed state lines operated with terrifying advantages that allowed some to continue murdering for decades as jurisdictions worked in isolation. The constitutional structure of American law enforcement, with local, state, and federal agencies having different jurisdictions and limited communication, created seams in the system that mobile killers exploited. Ted Bundy understood this perfectly, committing murders in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida, knowing that police departments in different states weren't systematically sharing information about similar unsolved murders. Each jurisdiction investigated its own cases, sometimes unaware that identical murders were occurring elsewhere. Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole traveled constantly, and while Lucas's confessions were largely false, the cases highlighted how transient killers could operate across the country with minimal risk of connection between crimes. The development of VICAP in 1985 began addressing this problem, but participation was voluntary and many departments didn't input their cases. The highway serial killings discussed earlier represent the extreme version of this problem, truck drivers crossing dozens of states, leaving victims along remote highways, creating a trail of bodies that might never be connected without national coordination. Modern improvements include mandatory reporting to federal databases, instant electronic communication between agencies, and task forces that specifically look for multi-jurisdictional patterns. However, killers still understand that crossing state lines complicates investigation, and some deliberately do so to exploit remaining gaps in coordination. The jurisdictional problem extends beyond states. County and city boundaries create similar issues on smaller scales, and international borders present even greater challenges when killers operate in multiple countries. Story 50, The Eyewitness Paradox. Serial killer investigations often reveal a troubling paradox. Numerous people encounter the killer or witness suspicious behavior, but human perception, memory, and tendency to rationalize unusual events mean these encounters often go unreported or aren't recognized as significant until hindsight connects them. Ted Bundy was seen by multiple witnesses at various crime scenes and abduction sites. Some reported his suspicious behavior, but their descriptions varied: different hair colors, different facial hair, different estimated ages, making pattern recognition difficult. Human memory is unreliable, particularly under stress, and witnesses often unconsciously incorporate information they learn later into memories of what they actually saw. The phenomenon of change blindness means people often don't notice things that should be obvious, especially if those things don't fit their expectations. A man with a woman who appears drunk or ill might be helping her to a car, or he might be abducting a victim. Witnesses typically default to benign interpretation. Several people saw Jeffrey Dahmer with victims before their murders, some even hearing screams or witnessing disturbing behavior, but the tendency to avoid involvement or trust authority when police are called means opportunities for intervention were missed. One of Dahmer's victims, a 14-year-old boy, was actually encountered by police after escaping but was returned to Dahmer when he convinced officers the boy was his adult partner having a domestic dispute. Witnesses who had called police watched this happen, their concerns dismissed. Understanding the eyewitness paradox has led to public education campaigns about reporting suspicious behavior and trusting instincts even when situations might have innocent explanations. It's also led to more serious investigation of citizen reports rather than dismissing concerns. The paradox extends to the killer's family and associates. People often say afterward they noticed troubling signs but rationalized them at the time, demonstrating how we resist believing someone we know could be capable of monstrous acts. Story 51, The Technological Arms Race. Each advancement in forensic technology changes both how investigators work and how killers adapt, creating an ongoing arms race between detection and evasion that shapes criminal methodology across generations. In the era before fingerprinting, killers didn't think about gloves. Once fingerprint analysis became standard, gloves became common. When blood typing emerged, killers learned to clean scenes more thoroughly. DNA analysis revolutionized everything in the 1980s and 1990s. Suddenly, biological evidence invisible to the naked eye could definitively identify perpetrators. Israel Keyes studied forensic science extensively and went to extraordinary lengths to avoid leaving DNA evidence, wearing multiple layers of clothing, using zip ties instead of rope to avoid fiber evidence, and even avoiding speaking unnecessarily to victims to prevent witnesses from later identifying voice patterns. His precautions demonstrate how sophisticated some killers become about forensic countermeasures. Digital forensics created new vulnerabilities for killers to manage: cell phone location data, internet search histories, electronic communications, and surveillance cameras everywhere. Modern killers must think about avoiding cameras, leaving phones at home, using cash instead of cards, and avoiding any digital trail. However, the ubiquity of surveillance makes complete avoidance nearly impossible. License plate readers, security cameras, and cell towers create overlapping coverage that's difficult to entirely escape. The arms race continues with emerging technologies, facial recognition software, advanced DNA analysis requiring smaller samples, and AI systems that can identify patterns across massive datasets of unsolved crimes. Each advancement tips the balance toward investigators, forcing killers to adapt methods or accept higher risk of capture. This technological pressure is one reason some criminologists believe serial murder rates have declined in recent decades. It's simply become much harder to get away with murder repeatedly. Story 52: The Prison Interviews. After capture, some serial killers become subjects of extensive psychological research through prison interviews that provide insights impossible to gain any other way, though researchers must navigate manipulation, self-serving narratives, and the ethical complexities of studying such individuals. The FBI's original interviews with imprisoned serial killers in the 1970s and 1980s laid the groundwork for criminal profiling, but they also revealed how these individuals manage their self-presentation even after conviction. Edmund Kemper was remarkably forthcoming, discussing his crimes, motivations, and psychological state in detail. His high intelligence and relative honesty made him a valuable research subject, though even his accounts served his ego. He enjoyed being studied and taken seriously as a case study. Ted Bundy gave numerous interviews but was notoriously manipulative, using them to maintain attention, control narratives, and play psychological games with interviews. Shortly before his execution, he claimed pornography caused his crimes, a claim researchers largely dismissed as attempts to shift responsibility and gain sympathy. Jeffrey Dahmer participated in multiple interviews, providing insights into his specific pathology. He described his crimes matter-of-factly, showed some apparent remorse, and helped researchers understand the progression from fantasy to action to escalation. However, questions remain about whether his presentation was genuine or calculated to improve his prison experience. Dennis Rader's interviews after capture revealed his narcissism. He wanted to describe his intelligence, his planning, and his ability to fool everyone for decades. His need for recognition drove both his crimes and his willingness to discuss them. The challenge in prison interviews is separating truth from self-serving fiction, genuine insight from manipulation, and accounting for how imprisonment changes individuals from who they were while active. Despite limitations, these interviews provide data impossible to obtain otherwise and have significantly advanced understanding of serial killer psychology. Story 53: The Victim Selection Process. Understanding exactly how serial killers select specific victims from the larger pool of potential targets reveals sophisticated decision-making processes that investigators can use to predict behavior and prevent future crimes. Selection criteria vary by killer but follow consistent internal logic for each individual. Ted Bundy sought women resembling his college girlfriend, young, attractive, long dark hair parted in the middle, and often approached them at universities or near college campuses. His selection combined physical type with location type, creating a pattern investigators eventually recognized. Dennis Rader selected victims based on surveillance. He stalked neighborhoods, watched houses, learned routines, and chose victims based on vulnerability and opportunity within his preferred victim type. Gary Ridgway selected sex workers almost exclusively, targeting women working the SeaTac Strip in Washington, choosing victims he believed wouldn't be missed or prioritized by police. His victim selection demonstrated calculated thinking about minimizing risk of serious investigation. Some killers have rigid victim criteria. Wrong hair color, wrong age, wrong location means they simply won't select that person no matter how vulnerable. Others are more opportunistic within broad parameters. The victim selection process often includes a stalking or surveillance phase where killers observe potential victims before deciding. This phase creates opportunities for intervention if witnesses notice repeated sightings of suspicious vehicles or individuals. Understanding victim selection helps investigators in multiple ways. It helps identify potential future targets for warning and protection, suggests geographic areas where the killer will hunt, reveals the killer's comfort zones and access, and provides psychological insights into what the victims represent to the killer. Some victims are surrogates for specific people in the killer's life, and understanding who they represent helps predict the selection pool. The selection process also often includes a triggering event immediately before victim acquisition, an argument, job stress, or personal rejection that destabilizes the killer's control and triggers the hunting behavior. Story 54: The Investigative Intuition. Despite advances in forensic science and criminal profiling, experienced homicide detectives often speak of intuition, a difficult-to-articulate sense that something is wrong or that a particular suspect is guilty, that plays crucial roles in solving serial cases. This intuition isn't mystical but rather the result of pattern recognition developed through years of experience processing thousands of pieces of information, many consciously forgotten but influencing judgment. Detective Bob Keppel, who worked the Ted Bundy case and later consulted with Bundy on the Green River Killer investigation, described moments when small details triggered recognition that cases were connected or that interviews weren't truthful. The intuition manifested as discomfort, a feeling that something was off about a crime scene or suspect statement. Experienced investigators notice micro-expressions, subtle inconsistencies, or behavioral patterns that contradict statistical norms without consciously identifying exactly what triggered their concern. David Reichert, the detective who eventually arrested Gary Ridgway, interviewed him multiple times over the years and later described always feeling Ridgway was involved despite lack of evidence. That intuition kept Ridgway on the suspect list until DNA technology finally provided proof. The challenge lies in balancing intuition with evidence. Gut feelings alone don't constitute probable cause or proof of guilt, and investigators must find concrete evidence to support their intuitions. Some wrongful convictions have resulted from investigators becoming too committed to intuition-based theories and unconsciously interpreting ambiguous evidence to fit preconceived conclusions. Modern investigative protocols encourage documenting intuitive concerns but require evidence-based verification before acting. The best outcomes occur when intuition guides investigation direction but evidence ultimately determines conclusions. Newer investigators often struggle because they lack the experimental database for effective pattern recognition, which is why pairing experienced detectives with newer partners helps develop these crucial instincts over time. Story 55: The Sentencing Disparities. Serial killer cases reveal troubling disparities in sentencing that raise questions about consistency, fairness, and whether factors beyond the crimes themselves, like race, gender, location, and victim characteristics, influence judicial outcomes. Gary Ridgway avoided the death penalty by confessing to dozens of murders and providing body locations, receiving life sentences instead. Ted Bundy was executed after refusing deals and maintaining his innocence until facing overwhelming evidence. Both killed numerous women, but their different approaches to the justice system led to different outcomes. Eileen Wuornos, one of few female serial killers, was executed in 2002, though questions remain about whether male killers with similar victim counts and circumstances would have received death sentences. Research suggests female serial killers historically received lighter sentences than males with comparable crimes, though Wuornos represented an exception to this pattern. Samuel Little, who confessed to 93 murders, the most of any serial killer in U.S. history, received life sentences rather than death, partly due to his age and health at capture and partly due to cooperation in solving cold cases. The victims in serial killer cases also affect outcomes in troubling ways. Killers whose victims were predominantly from marginalized populations, sex workers, runaways, drug users, sometimes received less aggressive prosecution than those whose victims were middle class or had strong family advocacy. This disparity reflects broader justice system. Problems where victim characteristics shouldn't affect the perpetrator's culpability but often do influence investigation intensity, media coverage, and ultimately sentencing. Geographic location matters too, states with death penalty versus those without, and even counties within states that pursue capital punishment aggressively versus those that rarely do, creating different outcomes for similar crimes based primarily on where they occurred. Understanding these disparities doesn't provide easy answers but reveals how even in cases of the most extreme crimes, the justice system applies standards inconsistently based on factors beyond just the criminal acts themselves. Story 56, The Copycat Generation. The internet age created unprecedented access to information about serial killers, spawning a generation of individuals who study these crimes in disturbing detail and sometimes attempt to emulate or improve upon them in their own violence. True crime forums, detailed case files online, crime scene photographs leaked and shared, an extensive analysis of famous killers' methods provide a blueprint that previous generations didn't have. Randy Kraft, who killed in the 1970s and 1980s, had to learn through trial and error. Modern killers can study decades of cases, learning what mistakes led to capture and what techniques proved most successful in evading detection. This phenomenon concerns law enforcement because it accelerates the learning curve. First-time offenders might employ sophisticated counter-forensic techniques that previously took years of experience to develop. Some online communities glorify serial killers in disturbing ways, creating fan pages, sharing artwork, and discussing these criminals as anti-heroes or misunderstood figures. While these communities are small, they create environments where violent fantasies are normalized and even encouraged. Researchers monitoring these spaces occasionally identify individuals showing concerning escalation from fantasy discussion to planning actual crimes. The challenge lies in distinguishing thousands of people with morbid curiosity from the handful who might act. Most true crime enthusiasts are harmless, motivated by psychology interest or simple fascination with dark topics. But some individuals identify with killers, incorporate them into personal fantasies, and eventually move from passive consumption to active planning. The copycat generation also includes individuals who commit crimes specifically designed for notoriety, incorporating elements calculated to generate media coverage and internet discussion. They want to become the subject of future true crime content, creating a disturbing feedback loop where coverage of serial killers potentially inspires the next generation. Story 57, The Wellness Cost. The psychological toll on investigators, forensic personnel, victim advocates, and others who work serial killer cases represents a significant but often overlooked aspect of these investigations that affects careers and lives long after cases close. Homicide detectives working serial cases experience repeated exposure to horrific crime scenes, victim photographs, and details of torture and suffering that most people never encounter even once. This exposure accumulates over investigations lasting years or decades, creating trauma that manifests in various ways. Some investigators develop PTSD, experiencing nightmares, intrusive thoughts, and difficulty separating work from personal life. Relationships suffer when investigators can't discuss their cases due to confidentiality but carry the psychological weight home. Some turn to alcohol or other unhealthy coping mechanisms. The Green River Task Force implemented mandatory counseling and rotation schedules after recognizing the psychological damage to investigators who worked the case for years. Medical examiners and forensic technicians face similar challenges, performing autopsies and analyzing evidence from serial victims, seeing human evil in its most concrete physical manifestations. Victim advocates who support families through investigations and trials experience secondary trauma from witnessing others' grief and trauma over extended periods. The wellness cost extends to jurors in serial killer trials, who must view evidence and hear testimony about multiple murders in graphic detail. Research on jurors in high-profile serial cases shows many experience lasting psychological effects from the experience. Modern awareness of these costs has led to better support systems, mandatory counseling, peer support programs, limited time on particularly difficult cases, and recognition that this work creates genuine psychological injury requiring treatment. However, the nature of the work means some psychological cost is unavoidable, and those who choose to pursue justice in serial cases make significant personal sacrifices that often go unrecognized by the public. Story 58, The Unidentified Victims. One of the most haunting aspects of serial killer cases involves victims who remain unidentified even after the killer is caught and confesses, people whose lives ended violently but whose names, families, and stories remain unknown, sometimes decades later. Samuel Little, who confessed to 93 murders between 1970 and 2005, described many victims in detail, their appearance, where he met them, how he killed them, but couldn't provide names because he selected marginalized women whose identities he never learned. Investigators worked to match his descriptions and drawings to missing persons reports and unidentified remains, successfully identifying some but leaving others nameless still. Gary Ridgway confessed to killing approximately 70 women, but only 49 victims were definitively identified. He led investigators to remains, provided details, but couldn't always remember victims well enough to help identify them. Some he killed 30 years before confessing, and his memories had faded. These unidentified victims represent a particular tragedy. Their families never received confirmation of death, never had closure, never could properly grieve. Some are likely missing persons reports that were never connected to the serial cases. Others might never have been reported missing, having been estranged from family or living transient lifestyles. The challenge of identification has improved with DNA technology. Remains can be compared against missing persons databases, and familial DNA searching can identify victims whose own DNA isn't in systems. Forensic artists create facial reconstructions from skulls, helping generate public tips. Social media and true crime communities sometimes crowdsource identification efforts, comparing missing persons' descriptions to unidentified victims. Each identification, even decades later, provides closure and returns dignity to someone who was reduced to Jane Doe or simply a number. The existence of unidentified victims also means official victim counts are often minimums. The true numbers may be higher, with some victims never even found, let alone identified. 58 stories have now passed through our journey into darkness and understanding. Each tale reveals another facet of how justice pursues those who hide in plain sight, how science and dedication work together to solve the unsolvable. Feel yourself drifting deeper now, your breathing slow and steady, your body completely relaxed. 42 more stories remain to guide you through this long, quiet night. Rest peacefully, and let the journey continue its gentle path through the darkness toward the light of understanding. Story 59, The Prison Culture Impact. When serial killers enter the prison system, they encounter a unique social hierarchy where their crimes carry different weight than among the general public, and understanding this dynamic reveals how even among criminals, certain lines exist that most won't cross. In prison culture, crimes against children rank as the most despised, and those convicted of such offenses face violence from other inmates who maintain their own moral codes despite being incarcerated for serious crimes themselves. Jeffrey Dahmer was killed in prison in 1994 by a fellow inmate who specifically targeted him due to the nature of his crimes. John Wayne Gacy spent 14 years on death row in protective segregation, separated from the general population largely for his own safety. Dennis Rader required protective custody due to threats from other inmates disturbed by his crimes against entire families. However, some serial killers navigate prison successfully by maintaining low profiles or leveraging their notoriety carefully. Edmund Kemper, due to his intelligence and relatively cooperative nature, became a trusted prisoner who recorded audiobooks for the blind and was considered helpful by prison staff. His enormous size, 6 feet 9 inches, also likely discouraged violence from other inmates. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, received fan mail and marriage proposals in prison, demonstrating how some people's fascination with serial killers persists even after conviction. He maintained a defiant attitude, showing no remorse, which actually garnered respect from certain inmates who valued his refusal to show weakness. The prison experience varies dramatically based on the facility, the specific crimes, the killer's behavior and adaptability, and whether they're in general population or protective custody. Some killers continue manipulating and controlling others even in prison, while others withdraw into themselves. Understanding prison dynamics for serial killers matters because their behavior in custody sometimes provides additional psychological insights, whether they express genuine remorse, continue fantasizing about crimes, or adapt into model prisoners reveals different aspects of their psychology than their crimes alone suggest. Story 60, The Investigative Red Herrings. Serial killer investigations often become derailed by red herrings, false leads that seem compelling but ultimately waste precious time and resources while the real perpetrator continues operating undetected. The most common red herrings involve suspects who superficially fit profiles but didn't commit the crimes. During the Yorkshire Ripper investigation in England, police received a tape recording and letters from someone claiming to be the killer, dubbed Wareside Jack. The accent on the tape led investigators to focus extensively on suspects from that specific region, while the actual killer, Peter Sutcliffe, had a different accent and came from a different area. The hoax consumed enormous resources and allowed Sutcliffe to kill 3 more women before his eventual capture in 1981. It was later revealed the tape came from someone completely unrelated who thought his prank was amusing. In the BTK case, police investigated thousands of suspects over decades, some multiple times, before Dennis Rader's communication led to his identification. Among the false leads were men who confessed falsely, those accused by attention-seeking tipsters, and individuals who matched partial profiles but had alibis for specific murders. The Atlanta child murders investigation was complicated by initial theories about white supremacist involvement and later by speculation about multiple killers, when evidence eventually pointed to Wayne Williams as the primary perpetrator, though questions remain about whether he committed all attributed murders. Red herrings also include physical evidence that seems significant but proves irrelevant, a fiber that appears unique but actually comes from a common source, a vehicle description that matches thousands of cars, or witness descriptions that unconsciously incorporate features from media coverage rather than actual observation. Modern investigations try to avoid red herring traps through better evidence management and by maintaining awareness that the most obvious suspect or dramatic lead isn't always correct, but the pressure to solve active cases sometimes causes investigators to pursue compelling false leads more aggressively than warranted. Story 61: The Familial Aftermath. The families of serial killers face unique psychological and social challenges that continue long after their relatives' capture and conviction, living with the knowledge of what someone they loved was capable of and dealing with public perception. Many family members genuinely had no knowledge of the crimes. Dennis Rader's wife filed for immediate divorce upon his arrest, stating she had no suspicion of his double life during their 34-year marriage. His daughter later wrote a book processing her trauma, describing the man she knew as a father versus the monster who committed horrific crimes. The cognitive dissonance of reconciling these two versions of the same person creates profound psychological challenges. Some families stand by convicted killers despite overwhelming evidence, unable or unwilling to accept the truth. Others experience complete shattering of their understanding of their family member and their own judgment. The Bundy family maintained that Ted couldn't be guilty for some time, with his mother refusing to believe it even after his confessions. John Wayne Gacy's family faced not only the horror of his crimes but also the revelation that bodies were buried under their home where they'd lived, creating additional trauma layers. Children of serial killers face particular challenges: genetic concerns about inheriting violent tendencies, social stigma from sharing a name with a notorious killer, and complex grief over losing a parent to either execution or life imprisonment while simultaneously learning that parent committed monstrous acts. Some change their names and relocate to escape association. Family members often receive death threats from people who believe they must have known something or that genetic relation makes them dangerous. Support groups exist specifically for families of notorious criminals, providing space to process unique grief and trauma. The families lost not only their relative but often their own sense of identity and place in their communities, becoming defined by association with crimes they didn't commit and often never suspected were occurring. Story 62: The Motive Spectrum. Serial killers operate along a spectrum of motivations more complex than simple categories suggest, and understanding the range and overlap of these drives helps investigators predict behavior and recognize patterns. The traditional categories: power, control, sexual gratification, financial gain, anger, revenge, attention-seeking, and psychotic delusion, provide framework, but individual killers often exhibit multiple motivations simultaneously. Dennis Rader's crimes were primarily about power and control, but he also desperately craved attention and recognition, which ultimately led to his capture when his need for acknowledgement overcame his caution. Jeffrey Dahmer's motivations combined sexual gratification with a deep fear of abandonment. He killed to keep people with him permanently, a twisted response to loneliness. His attempts to create zombies who would stay with him willingly represented the ultimate fantasy of companionship without the risk of rejection. Eileen Wuornos claimed self-defense and revenge against men who'd harmed her or represented men who had, though investigation suggested her motivations were more complex, possibly including financial gain and psychological deterioration. Harold Shipman's motivations remain debated. Some researchers believe he experienced godlike feelings of power over life and death, others think he became addicted to the family's grief responses, and some suggest underlying sexual motivation despite lack of direct evidence. The challenge in understanding motivation lies in killers' unreliability as sources. Some don't truly understand their own motivations, others deliberately obscure them, and many provide self-serving narratives that paint themselves in relatively better light. Ted Bundy blamed pornography shortly before execution, a claim most experts dismissed as attempt to shift responsibility. Understanding the motivation spectrum helps investigators in several practical ways. It suggests victim selection patterns, predicts escalation timing, indicates what circumstances might trigger cooling-off period endings, and helps determine whether multiple crimes with similar methods might actually involve different perpetrators with different underlying drives. Story 63: The Preventive Failures. Many serial killer cases reveal moments when intervention might have prevented future murders, missed opportunities that haunt investigators, families, and systems responsible for public safety. Edmund Kemper was released from psychiatric detention at age 21 despite doctors' warnings that he remained dangerous, having killed his grandparents at 15. The state system released him anyway, and he went on to kill 8 more people, including 6 young women and his mother. The question of whether the system failed or whether he was simply impossible to predict remains debated. Jeffrey Dahmer's case involves multiple preventive failures. Police returned a drugged, bleeding 14-year-old victim to him after he convinced officers it was a domestic dispute between adults, despite witnesses' protests. Had officers investigated properly, 13 subsequent murders might have been prevented. Earlier, Dahmer had been convicted of sexual assault of a minor but received only probation, a sentence that didn't prevent his escalation. John Wayne Gacy was convicted of sexual assault in 1968 and served time, yet after release, continued operating with minimal supervision, eventually murdering 33 young men and boys. His first known murder victim was killed during his parole period, suggesting more intensive supervision might have prevented the majority of his crimes. The systemic failures that allow serial killers to continue operating include inadequate mental health treatment, probation and parole systems stretched too thin to effectively monitor dangerous offenders, jurisdictional communication failures where one agency doesn't know about warnings from another, and tendency to believe superficial normalcy over documented concerning behavior. Some preventive failures involve specific individuals who saw warning signs but didn't report them or weren't taken seriously when they did. Understanding these failures has led to reforms, better information sharing, more serious treatment of early offenses, improved risk assessment tools, and cultural shifts toward taking reports more seriously even when they come from marginalized people or concern superficially respectable community members. Story 64: The Confession Complexity. The process of obtaining confessions from serial killers involves complex psychology and strategy, with some killers confessing readily while others maintain innocence despite overwhelming evidence, and these differences reveal important aspects of their psychology. Edmund Kemper turned himself in and confessed fully, even providing details investigators didn't know and leading them to evidence. His confession seemed motivated by genuine inability to stop himself and desire to be caught before he killed again. He expressed what appeared to be authentic remorse, particularly regarding his mother whom he killed along with her friend. Dennis Rader confessed immediately upon arrest, seemingly relieved and eager to discuss his crimes in detail. His confession was self-serving. He wanted credit, recognition, and opportunity to explain his intelligence and planning. He showed no genuine remorse but rather pride in his accomplishments. Ted Bundy maintained innocence for years despite mounting evidence, only confessing to some murders shortly before his execution in apparent attempt to delay it. His confessions were manipulative, parceled out strategically to maintain control and attention. He never confessed to all suspected murders, taking some secrets to his death. Gary Ridgway initially denied involvement until DNA evidence proved his guilt, then confessed to approximately 70 murders as part of a plea deal to avoid execution. His confession seemed motivated purely by self-preservation rather than remorse or conscience. Some killers never confess, the Zodiac Killer was never identified or caught, and various suspects who've been seriously considered have maintained innocence. Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, pled guilty to avoid the death penalty but has never publicly discussed his crimes or motivations, maintaining silence that frustrates investigators and victims' families who want to understand why. The confession patterns reveal narcissism, psychopathy, and control needs. Even after capture, some killers continue playing games, maintaining power through what they reveal or withhold. Story 65: The Geographic Anchors. Beyond general comfort zones, serial killers often operate around specific geographic anchors, locations of deep personal significance that provide psychological grounding even as they commit crimes that might seem random. These anchors typically include childhood homes, first significant residences, workplaces, or locations of formative experiences both positive and traumatic. Understanding these anchors helps investigators narrow search areas and sometimes identify suspects. Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, killed predominantly in areas of northern England where he worked as a truck driver, but detailed mapping revealed his crimes clustered around his home and his mother's home, suggesting both locations served as anchor points from which he operated. Gary Ridgway disposed of victims in areas where he'd played as a child, hiked as a young man, and visited throughout his life. The Green River and surrounding forests represented deeply familiar territory where he felt comfortable and confident. This familiarity allowed him to find isolated disposal sites and return to them repeatedly without getting lost or appearing suspicious. Dennis Rader's crimes occurred almost entirely in Wichita, Kansas, where he'd lived since childhood, worked, and raised his family. His geographic range was remarkably constrained, suggesting the familiar environment was crucial to his sense of control and safety. Some killers have multiple anchor points if they've relocated during their lives, creating distinct crime clusters in different cities connected by their personal history. The concept of geographic anchors intersects with environmental psychology. People develop deep, often unconscious connections to places where significant life events occurred, and these connections influence behavior even in criminal contexts. Killers might avoid areas where they'd be recognized but operate near enough to anchor points to maintain psychological comfort. They might dispose of bodies in places that hold secret personal meaning, forests where they played, roads they traveled with family, areas associated with specific memories. Understanding anchor points requires investigating not just where a suspect currently lives but their entire geographic history, and this investigation sometimes reveals the key to understanding their operational territory. Story 66: The Trauma Response Variation. Not all serial killers experience severe childhood trauma, and not all severely traumatized children become violent criminals, revealing that the relationship between early adverse experiences and later serial murder is more complex than simple causation. While 70 to 90% of serial killers report significant childhood trauma, that means 10 to 30% don't, suggesting other pathways to serial violence exist. Some researchers focus on neurological differences. Brain imaging studies show abnormalities in areas controlling impulse, emotional regulation, and empathy in many serial killers, though whether these are congenital or caused by trauma remains debated. Ted Bundy's childhood, while unusual due to the deception around his parentage, being told his mother was his sister, was not characterized by the severe physical abuse common in many serial killers' backgrounds. His development into a serial killer might involve genetic factors, neurological differences, or more subtle psychological damage than obvious physical abuse. Dennis Rader came from a relatively normal family without reported severe abuse, suggesting his development of violent fantasies stemmed from sources other than trauma response. His case challenges simple trauma-based theories of serial killer development. Jeffrey Dahmer reported feeling different from a very young age, describing persistent fantasies of death and control that predated any identifiable trauma. While his parents' troubled marriage and eventual divorce affected him, his psychological development seemed to follow an internal trajectory not entirely explained by external circumstances. The variation in trauma response also reveals resilience factors, why some children emerge from horrific abuse without becoming violent while others with seemingly better childhoods develop into killers. Protective factors include supportive relationships with even one adult, intervention services, natural resilience, and various genetic and neurological factors that buffer against trauma effects. Current understanding suggests serial killer development requires convergence of multiple factors: genetic predisposition, neurological abnormalities, trauma during critical developmental periods, lack of protective factors, and triggering events that destabilize coping mechanisms, with no single factor sufficient to create a serial killer alone. Story 67: The Legal Loopholes. Serial killer cases have revealed numerous legal loopholes and procedural issues that sometimes allowed killers to continue operating or complicated prosecution, leading to reforms in criminal justice procedures. The Miranda rights requirement, established in 1966, initially created challenges for prosecuting cases where confessions were obtained without proper warnings. Some serial killer convictions from earlier eras were overturned on procedural grounds even when guilt was clear. The exclusionary rule, which prohibits illegally obtained evidence from being used in court, has sometimes prevented prosecution despite investigators knowing who committed crimes. These protections exist for important civil liberties reasons but occasionally create difficult situations in serial cases. Jurisdictional issues represent persistent loopholes. When murders occur in multiple counties or states, questions arise about where to prosecute, whether to combine trials, and how to handle situations where evidence sufficient for conviction exists in one jurisdiction but not others. Gary Ridgway was prosecuted in King County, Washington for murders committed there, but suspected murders in other jurisdictions couldn't be prosecuted without bodies or evidence meeting legal standards. Double jeopardy protections mean once someone is acquitted, they cannot be tried again for the same crime even if new evidence emerges. This constitutional protection prevents government harassment but occasionally means guilty people escape justice when juries make mistakes or evidence emerges too late. Statute of limitations issues affect older cases, though most jurisdictions have eliminated such limits for murder. Some serial killers avoided prosecution for earlier crimes because too much time had passed before authorities connected them to those murders. Plea bargains represent controversial but necessary tools. Gary Ridgway's deal, where he confessed to dozens of murders in exchange for avoiding execution, provided closure to families but meant he escaped death penalty despite being possibly the most prolific American serial killer. These legal complexities reveal tension between protecting rights and achieving justice, with serial cases often highlighting the stakes involved in these constitutional protections. Story 68: The Victim Advocacy Evolution. The role of victim advocacy in serial killer cases has evolved significantly from eras when victims' families had no voice in proceedings to modern victim impact statements and family liaison officers who keep families informed throughout investigations and trials. Historically, victims' families were largely excluded from the criminal justice process. They might not be notified of hearings, had no input into plea bargains, and learned about case developments through media rather than official channels. The families of Ted Bundy's victims experienced frustration as he manipulated court proceedings for years, with families having no formal role except as potential witnesses. The victims' rights movement that gained momentum in the 1980s transformed this landscape, establishing that families deserved information, consideration, and opportunity to address courts. Modern serial killer investigations typically include victim advocates who work specifically with families, providing updates on investigation progress, explaining legal procedures, accompanying families to court proceedings, and connecting them with counseling and support services. These advocates serve as bridges between law enforcement and families, translating technical information and helping families navigate systems that can be confusing and overwhelming. Victim impact statements, now standard in sentencing phases, allow families to address courts directly about how crimes affected their lives. In serial cases with multiple victims, these statements can continue for hours or days as family after family describes their loss. The cumulative effect often provides powerful testimony to the human cost behind statistics about victim numbers. Some jurisdictions assign specific detectives to maintain contact with families throughout investigations lasting years or decades, building relationships and ensuring families remain informed even during inactive periods when no progress is occurring. The evolution of victim advocacy recognizes that families are also victims of serial crimes, suffering trauma that extends beyond the immediate loss of their loved one to include years of uncertainty, trial stress, and media invasion of their privacy during the most painful experiences of their lives. 68 stories have now carried you deeper into this exploration of darkness and the pursuit of justice that follows. Each tale reveals another layer: the psychology, the investigation, the human impact that extends far beyond the crimes themselves. Your breathing is slow and steady now, your body completely relaxed as you drift peacefully. 32 more stories remain to guide you through the quiet hours until morning comes. Rest deeply, and let the journey continue its gentle path through understanding. Story 69, The Forensic Countermeasures. As forensic science advanced, some serial killers studied these techniques and implemented sophisticated countermeasures designed to frustrate investigation, creating a cat-and-mouse game between criminal methodology and detection capabilities. Israel Keyes represents perhaps the most forensically aware American serial killer, having extensively researched DNA evidence, surveillance systems, and investigative techniques before beginning his murder series. He buried kill kits containing weapons and tools years in advance in remote locations, avoiding retail purchases that could be traced. He paid cash for everything related to his crimes, turned off his cell phone during operations, and drove rental cars rather than his own vehicle. He selected victims randomly rather than following a type, specifically to avoid pattern recognition. Despite these extreme precautions, he was ultimately caught through bank card usage and surveillance footage after he deviated from his careful protocols. Joel Rifkin, who killed 17 women in New York in the early 1990s, learned about forensic techniques and began wearing gloves, cleaning crime scenes with bleach, and disposing of victims' personal effects separately from bodies to break connections. His awareness came partly from consuming media coverage of other serial killers' captures and understanding what mistakes led to their identification. Robert Yates, active in Spokane in the 1990s, specifically targeted sex workers and disposed of bodies in ways designed to degrade DNA evidence, leaving them outdoors where weather and animals would destroy biological material. He was aware that investigators would eventually connect the crimes but hoped to slow the process enough to avoid capture. The emergence of forensically sophisticated killers has forced investigators to adapt, looking beyond physical evidence to behavioral patterns, digital footprints, and investigative techniques that don't rely solely on trace evidence. Modern investigations combine traditional evidence with newer tools like cell phone location data, license plate readers, and surveillance networks that create overlapping coverage difficult for even aware criminals to completely avoid. Story 70, The Myth of the Genius Killer. Popular culture perpetuates the myth that serial killers possess extraordinary intelligence, but statistical analysis reveals most have average or below average IQ, with only a small percentage demonstrating the brilliance often attributed to them in fiction. The criminal mastermind narrative flatters killers' egos and makes for compelling entertainment, but it obscures the reality that most serial killers are caught through routine police work, luck, or their own mistakes rather than elaborate psychological chess matches with investigators. Ted Bundy, often cited as the archetypal intelligent serial killer, did possess above-average intelligence and used it to evade capture for years, but his ultimate capture came from a routine traffic stop where his suspicious behavior drew attention, not from investigators outsmarting his master plan. Edmund Kemper has a very high IQ, estimated around 145, but he ultimately turned himself in because he couldn't stop killing and knew capture was inevitable. His intelligence didn't prevent him from being caught, it just allowed him to articulate his psychology more clearly in interviews afterward. Most serial killers demonstrate average problem-solving abilities and succeed primarily through victim vulnerability and investigative gaps rather than superior intellect. Richard Ramirez left fingerprints, DNA, and survivor witnesses throughout his crime spree, hardly the work of a genius. John Wayne Gacy buried bodies under his house, a disposal method that guaranteed discovery. Dennis Rader sent a floppy disk to police after asking if they could trace it and believing their lie when they said no, hardly brilliant criminal thinking. The perpetuation of the genius myth serves several harmful purposes. It romanticizes serial killers, potentially inspiring copycat behavior from individuals who identify with the fictional image, and it obscures the reality that these are often pathetic individuals whose crimes reflect weakness and cowardice rather than strength or intelligence. Understanding that most serial killers are not masterminds helps both prevention and investigation by focusing resources on realistic profiles rather than fictional archetypes. Story 71, The Dormancy Periods. Some serial killers experience extended dormancy periods lasting years or even decades when they commit no murders, and understanding why these periods occur and what ends them provides crucial insights into the psychology of compulsion and control. Dennis Rader had dormancy periods of 8 years between some murders, during which he appeared to function normally, but he later revealed he satisfied his urges through other means: burglary, stealing women's underwear, self-bondage, and elaborate fantasy rituals that provided enough satisfaction to delay the need for actual murder. His dormancy ended when these substitute activities no longer provided adequate psychological release. BTK's final dormancy lasted from 1991 until his communication with police in 2004, 25 years without killing, though he remained obsessed with his crimes and legacy. The dormancy ended not with another murder but with his need for recognition overpowering his self-preservation instinct. Some researchers believe certain killers achieve enough psychological satisfaction from their crimes that they can stop permanently, though this remains controversial. The question of whether serial killers can truly stop or merely experience extended dormancy without guarantee of remaining inactive remains debated. Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, apparently stopped killing after 1986, living another 32 years before his 2018 arrest with no known murders during that period. Whether he genuinely stopped or simply wasn't caught for additional crimes remains uncertain. Investigators must consider dormancy when investigating cold cases. Just because years have passed doesn't mean the killer is dead, imprisoned for other crimes, or relocated. They might be living quietly nearby, their compulsion currently dormant but potentially renewable. Some dormancy periods end due to life stressors, or job loss, relationship failure, health problems, or other destabilizing events that undermine whatever coping mechanisms allowed the killer to refrain from violence. Understanding dormancy patterns helps investigators predict when inactive killers might resume activity and identify warning signs in suspects' life circumstances that might trigger renewed violence. Story 72. The Interrogation Room Psychology. The physical and psychological environment of interrogation rooms plays crucial roles in obtaining information from serial killer suspects, with every element from room temperature to investigator word choice carefully calculated to encourage confession. Modern interrogation facilities are designed with specific psychological purposes. Small, windowless rooms create isolation and disorientation, uncomfortable temperatures and hard chairs create physical stress, and recording equipment is sometimes visible to remind suspects that everything is documented while other times hidden to reduce self-consciousness. The read technique, traditionally used for interrogation, involves confrontation and psychological pressure, but serial killer interrogations often benefit from alternative approaches that appeal to ego and desire for understanding. Special Agent Robert Ressler and others learned that treating serial killers with apparent respect and curiosity rather than condemnation often yielded better results. These individuals want to feel understood, special, and recognized for their perceived intelligence. The physical positioning in the room matters too. Sitting at slight angles rather than directly confrontational across a table reduces defensiveness. Allowing the suspect some physical comfort paradoxically makes them more psychologically vulnerable by creating unexpected gratitude and obligation. The interrogator's demeanor requires careful calibration based on the suspect's psychology, and narcissistic killers respond to flattery and recognition, while those with dominant personalities might respond better to challenges that engage their need to prove superiority. Some interrogations last many hours, with investigators building rapport through seemingly casual conversation before gradually introducing evidence and confronting lies. The use of evidence during interrogation follows strategic patterns, revealing some evidence to show investigation strength while withholding key details to verify later confessions are genuine. False confessions remain concerns even in serial cases, so modern protocols emphasize obtaining information only the true perpetrator would know and avoiding leading questions that contaminate the confession with investigator-supplied details. Story 73. The Media Blackout Strategy. Some serial killer investigations employed media blackout strategies to prevent the killer from knowing investigative progress or to avoid triggering acceleration, though these approaches created tension between public safety warnings and investigative needs. The traditional logic behind media blackouts holds that extensive coverage provides killers with exactly what many want: attention, fame, and power over public discourse, while also educating them about what investigators know and what forensic techniques might detect their crimes. The Zodiac killer specifically demanded media attention, threatening additional violence if newspapers didn't publish his letters. Compliance gave him precisely what he sought, potentially encouraging continued activity. Some jurisdictions learned to withhold certain information even while acknowledging ongoing investigations. Details about signatures, specific evidence types, or particular victim characteristics might not be disclosed to maintain investigative advantages. When suspects emerge, information they reveal that hasn't been publicized can verify their involvement. However, media blackouts create serious problems too. Communities facing active serial killers deserve warnings to take precautions. Potential witnesses might have crucial information but won't come forward if they don't know their observations are relevant, and media attention often generates tips that solve cases. The balance between these competing concerns remains difficult. The Green River investigation initially maintained relative media silence, but as the body count climbed, public pressure forced more disclosure. The massive publicity eventually helped generate the tip that led to Gary Ridgway's initial identification as a suspect, though DNA evidence ultimately proved his guilt years later. Modern approaches favor controlled information release, providing enough detail to warn the public and generate tips while withholding specific elements that serve investigative purposes. Press conferences become strategic tools where investigators carefully calibrate what they reveal, sometimes including subtle messages designed to provoke specific reactions from the killer if he's watching. Story 74: The Juvenile Justice Dilemma. Serial killers who begin murdering as juveniles create profound dilemmas for justice systems designed around rehabilitation of young offenders rather than permanent incapacitation of dangerous individuals who will likely kill again if released. Edmund Kemper killed his grandparents at age 15, was sent to a psychiatric facility until age 21, was then released despite some doctors' warnings, and went on to kill 8 more people including his mother. His case exemplifies the challenge of predicting which violent juveniles will continue violence into adulthood versus those who can be rehabilitated. The question of whether the system failed by releasing him or whether he was simply unpredictable remains contested. Mary Bell in England killed 2 toddlers when she was 10 years old in 1968, one of the youngest serial killers documented. She was held until age 23, then released with a new identity. She has not re-offended, suggesting that some juvenile killers can be rehabilitated, though her case remains exceptional and controversial. Jesse Pomeroy in the 1870s began torturing younger children at age 11 and murdered 2 children at age 14, spending the rest of his life in prison, over 50 years, never released despite his young age at offense. His case established precedents for recognizing that some juvenile offenders pose permanent threats. The neurological reality that adolescent brains aren't fully developed, particularly in areas controlling impulse and moral reasoning, argues for different treatment of juvenile offenders. However, the severity of serial murder and high recidivism risk creates tension with rehabilitation-focused juvenile justice philosophy. Modern approaches involve intensive evaluation attempting to distinguish between adolescent impulsivity, mental illness, or trauma responses that might improve with treatment versus fundamental personality disorders and psychopathy that suggest permanent danger. Brain imaging, psychological testing, and behavioral analysis all contribute to these assessments, though perfect prediction remains impossible. The stakes involve both public safety and fairness to young offenders who might genuinely change versus those who never will. Story 75: The Victimology Patterns. Detailed analysis of victim characteristics across serial killer cases reveals patterns so consistent they provide crucial investigative tools, though these patterns also expose uncomfortable truths about which victims receive investigation priority and media attention. Serial killers overwhelmingly target vulnerable populations. Approximately 70% of victims are sex workers, runaways, drug users, homeless individuals, or others living on society's margins. This victim selection is deliberate. These individuals are easier to access, less likely to be immediately missed, and historically received less intensive investigation when they disappeared. Gary Ridgway explicitly stated he chose sex workers because he knew police wouldn't prioritize finding them, a calculation that proved tragically accurate for years as bodies accumulated before serious investigation began. The missing white woman syndrome describes media and investigation patterns where disappearances of young, attractive, middle-class white women receive extensive coverage while missing women of color, poor women, or those with stigmatized lifestyles receive minimal attention. This disparity means some serial killers operating in marginalized communities continue longer than those whose victims trigger immediate intensive response. Robert Yates's victims in Spokane were primarily sex workers and drug users, and the investigation initially received limited resources until public pressure forced escalation. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative documented this pattern nationally, hundreds of murdered sex workers and transient individuals along truck routes, many cases receiving minimal investigation when they occurred. Victim advocacy groups now work specifically to ensure equal investigation regardless of victim lifestyle, arguing that everyone deserves justice and that failure to investigate marginalized victims allows killers to continue operating. Understanding victimology patterns helps investigators predict where killers might strike next, identify potential future victims for warning and protection, and recognize connections between seemingly unrelated cases. The patterns also reveal uncomfortable truths about social values and which lives are treated as valuable versus expendable. Story 76, The Copycat Letter Writers. Serial killer cases attract not only false confessors but also copycat letter writers who mimic the killer's communications, creating investigative confusion and forcing police to spend resources distinguishing genuine communications from hoaxes. The Zodiac case generated numerous fake letters over decades, with people sending cryptic messages, symbols, and claims of additional murders. Investigators had to develop methods for authenticating communications, comparing handwriting, analyzing linguistic patterns, looking for details only the real Zodiac would know, and eventually using DNA from envelope adhesive when that technology became available. BTK's re-emergence in 2004 after 25 years of silence generated immediate copycat communications. People sent letters claiming to be BTK, trying to insert themselves into the high-profile case. Police used withheld details to quickly identify most as hoaxes, but each required investigation time. Some copycat writers are lonely individuals seeking attention, others have psychological issues driving them to associate with notorious crimes, and some simply find the game of fooling police entertaining. The Son of Sam case involved letters to newspapers, and distinguishing David Berkowitz's actual communications from copycats required careful analysis. Some copycats are remarkably sophisticated, researching cases extensively and crafting messages that seem plausible until careful examination reveals small inconsistencies. The digital era intensified this problem. Anonymous emails, social media messages, and online posts claiming to be from serial killers proliferate during active cases. The ease of anonymous communication means anyone can send messages purporting to be from the killer, and each must be taken seriously enough to investigate. Modern investigative protocols include maintaining careful records of genuine communications, looking for consistent linguistic patterns, and using digital forensics to trace online messages. Despite these tools, copycat communications remain persistent problems that waste investigative resources and sometimes mislead investigations during critical periods when every hour matters. Story 77, The Eyewitness Misidentification. Serial killer cases have revealed the profound unreliability of eyewitness testimony, with misidentification sometimes leading to wrongful accusations or allowing actual perpetrators to escape suspicion despite being seen. Human memory is not a recording but a reconstruction, influenced by stress, suggestion, time passage, and subsequent information exposure. Witnesses to serial crimes often operate under extreme stress during brief encounters, creating poor conditions for accurate memory formation. Ted Bundy was described by various witnesses with different hair colors, facial hair, heights, and builds. Descriptions varied so much that composite sketches barely resembled each other, let alone Bundy himself. Some survivors and witnesses gave descriptions matching him reasonably well, but others were significantly off, demonstrating how the same person can be perceived very differently by different witnesses. Cross-racial identification issues compound the problem. Witnesses are generally less accurate identifying individuals of different races than their own, a factor in several investigations where witness descriptions inadvertently misdirected resources. The malleability of memory means witnesses unconsciously incorporate details learned from media coverage, police questions, or conversations with other witnesses into their supposedly independent recollections. By the time of trial, their memory of the actual event has become mixed with memories of photographs they've seen, descriptions they've heard, and suggestions from various sources. DNA evidence has exonerated numerous people convicted largely on eyewitness testimony, revealing how convincing but completely wrong witnesses can be. In serial killer cases, this unreliability sometimes meant suspects were eliminated based on witnesses saying they didn't match, when in fact the witness memory was simply inaccurate. Modern investigative protocols emphasize immediate documentation of witness descriptions before contamination, sequential photo lineups rather than simultaneous, avoiding suggestive questioning, and understanding that witness confidence doesn't correlate with accuracy. Highly confident witnesses are often completely wrong. Story 78. The toxicology connection. Some serial killers used poison as their primary method, creating unique investigative challenges because poisoning deaths often appear natural, especially before modern toxicology testing could detect a wide range of substances. Harold Shipman, the British doctor who killed an estimated 250 to 400 patients, used diamorphine injections that caused death resembling natural heart failure in elderly patients already in poor health. His crimes continued for over 2 decades before suspicion arose, partly because doctors signing death certificates for their own patients was routine and victims were elderly with expected health problems. Only when he forged a will to inherit from a victim did investigation begin, eventually revealing his extensive murder series. Toxicology analysis of exhumed bodies showed diamorphine in remains, proving murder. Janine Jones, the Texas nurse who killed multiple infants through drug injections, operated in an environment where sick babies sometimes died despite medical intervention, providing cover for her murders. Only when statistical analysis showed death rates dramatically higher during her shifts did suspicion focus on her. The deaths appeared natural or as complications of existing conditions until pattern recognition triggered investigation. The advantage of poison from a killer's perspective includes distance from the act, no physical struggle. No violence, less psychological barrier than hands-on killing, and difficulty of detection, especially historically when toxicology testing was limited. Arsenic was historically popular because it was widely available and symptoms resembled common illnesses. Modern forensic toxicology has advanced dramatically, with testing capable of detecting hundreds of substances in minute quantities and distinguishing between therapeutic doses and lethal amounts. Hair and nail samples can show poisoning over time through accumulated traces. Despite these advances, poisoning deaths still sometimes go undetected initially, particularly in settings like hospitals or nursing homes where death is common and victims have existing health problems. The investigation of suspected poisoning cases requires different approaches than violent crimes. Statistical pattern analysis, toxicological expertise, and careful review of medical records become more important than traditional crime scene investigation. 78 stories have now guided you through this journey into understanding the darkest aspects of human behavior and the dedicated pursuit of justice that follows. Each tale has settled gently into your consciousness as you drift deeper into peaceful rest. Your breathing is slow and rhythmic, your body completely relaxed. 22 more stories remain to accompany you through the quiet night. Sleep deeply now, and let the journey continue its gentle path. Story 79, The Transformation of Profiling. Criminal profiling evolved from art based on intuition and experience into science grounded in data analysis and psychological research, fundamentally changing how investigators approach serial murder cases and predict offender characteristics. The early profilers like John Douglas and Robert Ressler relied heavily on their interviews with imprisoned killers and personal case experience, developing profiles through pattern recognition that was sophisticated but not systematically validated. Their organized versus disorganized typology, while useful, represented a simplification of more complex realities. As behavioral science advanced through the 1990s and 2000s, profiling incorporated rigorous statistical analysis of thousands of cases, identifying which crime scene characteristics actually correlate with which offender traits versus which associations were assumed but not supported by data. Modern profiling uses databases containing detailed information about solved cases. When certain crime scene elements appear, statistical analysis shows which offender characteristics most commonly accompany them, providing probability-based predictions rather than definitive statements. Geographic profiling, developed by Kim Rossmo, added mathematical precision to predicting where offenders live based on crime locations. Psychological profiling became more nuanced, moving beyond simple categories to complex personality assessments incorporating multiple dimensions of behavior and motivation. The field also became more humble about its limitations. Profiles are investigative tools that narrow suspect pools and suggest interview strategies, not magic solutions that identify specific individuals. Some high-profile failures, where profiles proved significantly inaccurate, taught important lessons about overconfidence. The BTK case involved profiles suggesting the killer was younger, less educated, and more socially isolated than Dennis Rader actually was, demonstrating that even experienced profilers can be wrong. Current best practices involve using profiles as one tool among many, validating predictions against evidence as investigations progress, and remaining open to revising profiles when they don't match emerging facts. The transformation from intuitive art to evidence-based science made profiling more reliable and defensible, though it remains an evolving field incorporating new research continuously. Story 80: The Digital Evidence Revolution. The explosion of digital evidence transformed serial killer investigations more profoundly than any advancement since DNA, creating vast new data sources that document behavior, location, and psychology in ways previous generations of investigators never imagined possible. Cell phone location data places individuals at specific locations within meters, creating movement timelines that confirm or destroy alibis with precision impossible through traditional methods. When Joseph DeAngelo was finally identified as the Golden State Killer, investigators obtained his DNA through genealogical databases, but they also used digital surveillance to confirm his movements and behaviors. Modern investigations routinely examine months or years of location data, mapping suspect movements against crime timing and locations. Internet search histories provide windows into psychology and planning, searches for specific victims' names or addresses, research about forensics or body disposal, interest in previous serial killers, or consumption of violent content all contribute to understanding suspects and building cases. The digital footprints people leave through social media, online purchases, email, text messages, and countless other electronic interactions create comprehensive records of their lives, interests, and activities. Israel Keyes tried desperately to avoid digital traces, paying cash and turning off his phone during crimes, but his occasional lapses, using a victim's bank card, being captured on ATM surveillance, ultimately led to his capture. The reality of modern life makes avoiding all digital evidence nearly impossible. License plate readers deployed throughout cities create additional location tracking independent of phones. Surveillance cameras, public, private, commercial, residential, blanket urban environments with overlapping coverage. Facial recognition technology can now identify individuals in crowds or analyze footage to find specific people. The challenge for investigators involves managing massive data volumes. Modern investigations might involve terabytes of video footage, thousands of location data points, and extensive digital communications requiring specialized software and trained analysts to process efficiently. Privacy concerns arise as these capabilities expand, requiring careful legal frameworks around when and how this data can be accessed, but the investigative power is undeniable. Story 81: The Life Sentence Reality. Serial killers receiving life imprisonment without parole face decades in custody, and understanding how they adapt, or fail to permanent incarceration provides insights into their psychology and raises questions about punishment, redemption, and what justice truly means. Some killers adapt surprisingly well to prison structure, finding routine and predictability more comfortable than the chaos of their previous lives, managing double identities and escalating compulsions. Edmund Kemper became a model prisoner, recording audiobooks for the blind and serving as a trusted inmate who posed minimal management problems. His intelligence and cooperative nature allowed him to find purpose and meaning even in permanent confinement. Dennis Rader struggled more significantly with incarceration, his narcissism and need for control clashing with the powerlessness of prison life. Reports suggest he expected different treatment due to his notoriety and struggled to accept his complete loss of status and autonomy. Some prisoners become different people over decades, whether through genuine psychological change, religious conversion, therapeutic intervention, or simply aging and maturation. Questions arise about whether someone imprisoned at 30 who shows significant change by 60 is essentially the same person who committed the crimes decades earlier. However, most serial killers show little genuine change, maintaining the same personality structures that contributed to their crimes. Psychopathy, narcissism, and other personality disorders don't typically improve significantly even with time and intervention. Gary Ridgway shows little evidence of genuine remorse or psychological transformation despite years in custody. The debate over life imprisonment versus execution often centers on whether permanent incarceration serves justice better than death. Families hold different views, with some preferring the killer live with consequences while others see execution as appropriate finality. The practical reality includes substantial costs, housing prisoners for 50 or 60 years involves significant expense, and questions about elderly prisoner management as serial killers from decades past age in custody with increasing medical needs. Story 82, The Cultural Fascination. Society's enduring fascination with serial killers reveals uncomfortable truths about human psychology, entertainment consumption, and the thin line between healthy interest in understanding evil versus problematic glorification of violence. True crime as entertainment genre has exploded over recent decades. Podcasts, documentaries, books, television series, and movies devoted to serial killers proliferate, drawing massive audiences who consume this content voraciously. The fascination serves multiple psychological functions. It allows exploration of darkness from safety, provides reassurance through narratives where killers are eventually caught, and satisfies natural curiosity about extreme human behavior. However, the line between education and entertainment blurs concerning ways. Some coverage sensationalizes killers, focusing more on their genius or mystery than on victims and consequences. Netflix series like Mindhunter dramatize investigations in ways that make serial killers fascinating antiheroes rather than pathetic criminals. The glamorization concerns experts who worry it potentially inspires copycat behavior from individuals who identify with romanticized portrayals. Online communities sometimes cross from interest into disturbing territory. Fan pages for killers like Ted Bundy or Richard Ramirez, people who write love letters to imprisoned killers, hybristophilia, and where individuals become attracted to criminals specifically because of their crimes. These phenomena, while involving small minorities, reveal something troubling about how culture sometimes transforms murderers into celebrities. The commercialization of serial murder, merchandise, tours of crime scenes, auction of killers' artwork, further demonstrates how fascination becomes monetized in ethically questionable ways. Some argue this cultural fascination serves important purposes. Keeping cases in public consciousness helps solve cold cases, educating people about warning signs might prevent future crimes, and understanding darkness helps appreciate light. Others contend that the saturation of serial killer content desensitizes society to violence and treats real human tragedy as entertainment product. The balance remains contested, with victims' families often expressing pain at seeing their loved ones' murders turned into entertainment consumed by people who treat it as compelling story rather than devastating reality they must live with forever. Story 83, The Investigative Burnout. The psychological toll on investigators working serial cases for years or decades often results in burnout that affects their careers, personal lives, and mental health long after cases close, representing hidden costs of pursuing these investigations. Detectives assigned to serial cases face unique stresses beyond typical homicide work. Multiple victims means multiple horrific crime scenes, grieving families, and weight of knowing the killer might strike again while they investigate. The pressure intensifies with media coverage and public fear demanding results. Dave Reichert, who worked the Green River case for nearly 20 years before Gary Ridgway's capture, described the investigation consuming his life, affecting his family relationships, and creating persistent psychological burden. Many investigators on that task force experienced similar effects: divorces, substance abuse problems, depression, and PTSD symptoms from prolonged exposure to extreme violence documentation. The frustration of working cases that don't solve quickly takes its toll, following leads that go nowhere, feeling responsibility each time another body appears, and accumulating years of effort without resolution creates profound demoralization. Some investigators spend entire careers on single serial cases, retiring without seeing resolution, which represents a particular form of professional and personal defeat despite their dedication. The rotating assignment policies developed partly to prevent this burnout by limiting how long individual investigators work serial cases, though this creates trade-offs with institutional knowledge and case familiarity. Mandatory counseling and peer support programs help address psychological impacts, though many investigators resist seeking help due to police culture emphasizing toughness and self-reliance. The long-term health consequences can be severe. Investigators who spent careers working violent crimes show elevated rates of cardiovascular disease, substance abuse, and suicide compared to general population. Some develop what's termed secondary traumatic stress, experiencing trauma symptoms from exposure to others' trauma even without direct victimization. Understanding and addressing investigative burnout improves both officer well-being and investigation quality, as burnt-out investigators make mistakes, miss connections, and cannot sustain the intense focus these cases require. Story 84: The Exoneration Implications. DNA evidence and improved forensic science haven't just caught serial killers, they've also exonerated people wrongly convicted of murders later attributed to serial offenders, revealing how flawed evidence and investigative pressure sometimes resulted in innocent people imprisoned while actual killers remained free to continue. The Innocence Project and similar organizations have used DNA testing to free dozens of wrongly convicted individuals, some of whom were imprisoned for murders that DNA later connected to known serial killers. These cases reveal that under pressure to solve high-profile murders, investigators sometimes fixated on wrong suspects, interpreting ambiguous evidence as confirmatory and overlooking alternative explanations. False confessions obtained through problematic interrogation methods, eyewitness misidentifications, unreliable forensic techniques like bite mark analysis or hair comparison, and sometimes prosecutorial misconduct all contributed to wrongful convictions. When the actual perpetrator was eventually identified through DNA, often years or decades later, the wrongful conviction revealed systematic failures. Some serial killers benefited from these wrongful convictions. While someone else was imprisoned for their crime, they continued operating without suspicion. The West Memphis 3 case, while not definitively connected to a serial killer, illustrates how tunnel vision on wrong suspects prevents finding actual perpetrators. Kirk Bloodsworth was wrongly convicted of a child murder, spent years on death row, and was eventually exonerated through DNA that later matched to a known offender. His case demonstrated how eyewitness testimony, pressure for conviction, and limited technology combined to imprison an innocent man. The implications extend beyond individual injustices. Each wrongful conviction means the real killer escaped justice, potentially committed additional murders, and reveals that the system designed to protect society sometimes fails catastrophically. Modern reforms including better interrogation protocols, blind photo lineups, recording all interviews, and DNA testing of evidence from closed cases attempt to prevent future wrongful convictions, but the historical cases serve as sobering reminders that certainty and actual truth don't always align in criminal justice. Story 85: The Military Connection. An uncomfortable but documented pattern shows military veterans disproportionately represented among serial killers, raising complex questions about combat trauma, training in violence, and responsibility without simple answers or stigmatization of veterans broadly. Studies suggest approximately 15 to 20% of serial killers have military backgrounds, higher than the general population percentage. The potential connections include combat trauma and PTSD creating psychological damage that manifests in violence, military training providing skills and comfort with violence that transfer to criminal contexts, and selection bias where individuals with pre-existing violent tendencies are drawn to military service. Dennis Rader served in the Air Force before his crimes, though his service was routine without combat exposure. Jeffrey Dahmer was in the Army briefly, discharged for alcoholism before his known murders began, though questions remain about potential earlier victims during his service. Gary Ridgway served in the Navy during Vietnam, though direct connections between his service and later crimes remain unclear. Some killers specifically developed skills in military service that they later applied criminally: comfort with weapons, physical conditioning, operational planning, and psychological toughness. However, the vast majority of veterans never commit violent crimes, and millions of combat veterans deal with trauma without becoming criminals. The connection, while statistically notable, doesn't suggest military service causes serial killing or that veterans should be viewed with suspicion. Rather, it suggests that for individuals with pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities, predispositions toward violence, or certain personality disorders, military experience might interact with those factors in ways that don't create but potentially accelerate violent trajectories. The failure to provide adequate mental health support for returning veterans exacerbates any connections. When PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and combat stress go untreated, some individuals deteriorate in ways that might include violence. Understanding the military connection requires nuance, avoiding both stigmatization of veterans broadly and ignoring legitimate questions about how combat exposure and violence training affect psychological development in vulnerable individuals. Story 86: The Statute of Limitations. While murder typically has no statute of limitations, serial killer cases sometimes involve related crimes that do have time limits, creating situations where killers might be prosecuted for some acts but not others, or where procedural issues complicate justice. In the Golden State Killer case, Joseph DeAngelo committed numerous rapes in the 1970s before escalating to murder in the late 1970s and 1980s. By the time of his 2018 arrest, the statute of limitations had expired on the rapes in most jurisdictions, meaning he could only be prosecuted for the murders despite dozens of sexual assault victims. This created a painful situation where rape survivors waited 40 years for justice only to learn prosecution was legally barred by time passage. California later passed legislation extending or eliminating statute of limitations for certain sex crimes partly in response to this case, but the changes didn't apply retroactively to DeAngelo. Some states have no statute of limitations for any felony, while others impose time limits varying from 3 years to 20 years depending on crime severity. For serial killers who committed various offenses over extended periods, these varying limits create patchwork of potential charges. Jurisdictional differences complicate matters further. A killer might face prosecution for murders in one state while similar crimes in another state are time-barred based on that state's laws. The policy debates around statute of limitations involve balancing several factors. Evidence quality degrades over time, making prosecution more difficult and wrongful conviction more likely. Witnesses die or memories fade. Defendants have rights to timely prosecution, but serious crimes deserve justice regardless of time passage. DNA evidence changed these calculations significantly. Now definitive identification is possible decades later when previously only fading memories and degraded evidence existed. Many jurisdictions have eliminated or extended limitations for DNA-eligible crimes, recognizing technology enables reliable prosecution impossible under earlier forensic capabilities. The result is a complex legal landscape where identical crimes might be prosecutable or not depending on when and where they occurred, what evidence exists, and what statutory changes happened in the intervening years. Story 87: The Interrogation False Confessions. Beyond false confessions from attention seekers, some innocent people confess to serial murders they didn't commit due to psychological pressure, mental illness, intellectual disability, or problematic interrogation techniques, complicating investigations and sometimes resulting in wrongful convictions. Henry Lee Lucas confessed to over 600 murders across the United States, and authorities initially believed him, closing numerous cases based on his confessions. Later investigation proved most confessions were false. He was incarcerated or in different states when many murders occurred, and his detailed knowledge came from crime scene photos and investigator questioning rather than actual perpetration. His case revealed how someone motivated by attention, food, cigarettes, and perceived lenient treatment could fabricate hundreds of false confessions that investigators accepted too readily. Some false confessions result from coercive interrogation techniques, hours of questioning, sleep deprivation, false claims about evidence, minimization of crime seriousness, and implied promises of leniency can break down innocent suspects until they confess simply to end the interrogation. Vulnerable populations including juveniles, intellectually disabled individuals, and mentally ill suspects are particularly susceptible. The phenomenon seems counterintuitive. Why would someone confess to murder they didn't commit, but psychological research documents it repeatedly? The Reid technique, traditional interrogation method, has been criticized for creating false confession risk through its confrontational approach and presumption of guilt. Individuals with certain personality types, cognitive limitations, or mental health conditions may confess to crimes including serial murder to please authority figures, escape interrogation stress, or due to confusion about reality. Modern protocols emphasize video recording all interrogations to document voluntariness, limiting interrogation duration, providing special protections for vulnerable suspects, and training investigators to recognize false confession risk factors. The challenge lies in distinguishing genuine confessions from false ones. Both can include detailed information if investigators inadvertently feed details through questions, and both can seem emotionally convincing if the confessor believes their own false narrative. Story 88: The Victim Recovery Efforts. The physical search for victims, recovering bodies, identifying remains, and bringing closure to families, represents crucial but often overlooked aspect of serial killer investigations that continues long after arrests and convictions. When Gary Ridgway confessed to approximately 70 murders as part of his plea bargain to avoid execution, he agreed to help locate victims' remains. Search teams spent months in Pacific Northwest forests following his directions to dump sites, finding bodies he'd killed decades earlier. The recovery effort provided closure to families who'd spent 20 years not knowing what happened to their daughters and sisters, finally allowing proper burial and mourning. However, some bodies Ridgway claimed to have left in specific areas were never found. Either his memory was wrong after so many years, environmental factors moved or destroyed remains, or he deliberately provided false information. Samuel Little drew detailed sketches of his approximately 90 victims and described dump locations, helping investigators match drawings to unidentified remains and missing persons reports. His cooperation came partly from desire for attention and partly from terminal illness, making him willing to discuss crimes that could no longer result in additional punishment. The FBI organized major effort matching his information to cold cases, successfully identifying numerous victims but leaving many still unknown. The physical challenge of victim recovery can be enormous: remote dump sites in rugged terrain, remains scattered by animals or erosion, decomposition making identification difficult, and sheer geographic scale when killers operated across multiple states. Specialized teams including cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, forensic anthropologists, and search and rescue experts work together on recovery efforts. The emotional challenge affects everyone involved. Searchers repeatedly find human remains in various decomposition states, knowing each set of bones represents someone's loved one who deserved better than to be discarded in the woods. Families often participate in searches, desperate to find closure but traumatized by the process and what they might find. The recovery effort represents the final act of restoring dignity to victims, bringing them home, and allowing families to begin healing. Story 89: The Lessons for Prevention. Decades of serial killer research, investigation, and prosecution have yielded important lessons about prevention, not preventing all serial murder, which may be impossible, but reducing frequency and catching killers earlier before victim counts accumulate. The most crucial lesson involves taking early warning signs seriously. Escalating violence, sexual offenses, stalking behavior, and patterns of control over others should trigger intervention rather than minimal consequences. Many serial killers had prior arrests for related crimes that were treated leniently, allowing escalation to murder. Enhanced communication between jurisdictions prevents killers from exploiting geographic boundaries. Modern databases connecting similar crimes across states mean patterns are recognized faster. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative specifically addresses how mobile killers exploited jurisdictional gaps. Public education about recognizing manipulation and trusting instincts has saved lives, teaching people, especially young women, to trust discomfort even when someone seems friendly helps prevent victimization. Several Bundy survivors described feeling something was wrong before overt threats appeared. Improved support for vulnerable populations reduces victim availability. When sex workers, runaways, and homeless individuals receive services and protection rather than criminalization, they're less accessible to predators and more likely to report suspicious approaches. Addressing childhood trauma and providing intervention for children showing warning signs might prevent some future serial killers from developing, though prediction remains imperfect and risks stigmatizing troubled children who won't become violent. The lessons also include investigative improvements, preserving evidence carefully even when cases seem unlikely to solve, maintaining cold case reviews as technology advances, and allocating resources to investigate all murders thoroughly regardless of victim characteristics. Perhaps most fundamentally, the lessons emphasize that serial killers aren't supernatural monsters but human criminals who can be caught through diligent investigation, that prevention is possible through early intervention, and that protecting all members of society regardless of lifestyle reduces overall vulnerability to these predators. Story 90: The Behavioral Consistency Paradox. One of the most valuable yet challenging aspects of serial killer investigation involves the paradox of behavioral consistency. Killers show remarkable consistency in some behaviors while varying unpredictably in others, and learning to distinguish which patterns remain stable helps investigators link crimes and predict future actions. The core psychological signature elements remain extraordinarily consistent because they fulfill deep, unchangeable needs rooted in the killer's fantasy life and emotional requirements. A killer who derives satisfaction from specific positioning of victims will repeat that positioning across crimes even when it's risky or impractical, because the psychological payoff demands it. However, practical elements, the modus operandi, evolve as killers learn from experience, adapt to close calls, and refine their techniques for efficiency and evasion. Early crimes often show experimentation and uncertainty, with killers testing different approaches to see what works. Later crimes demonstrate learned sophistication. They know how to approach victims more effectively, dispose of evidence more thoroughly, and avoid the mistakes that nearly led to earlier capture. This creates investigative challenges because some case linkage depends on consistent patterns, but over-reliance on exact repetition can cause investigators to miss connections when practical methods have evolved even as psychological signatures remained constant. Understanding which behavioral elements are compulsive and unchangeable versus which are practical and adaptive helps profilers distinguish core patterns from surface variations. The paradox extends to personality presentation as well. Killers show remarkable consistency in their fundamental psychology, their narcissism or psychopathy remaining stable throughout their lives, while their surface behavior adapts to whatever role they're currently performing. Dennis Rader maintained consistent underlying needs for binding, torture, and control across 3 decades, but his practical methods, his target selection, and his periods of dormancy varied based on life circumstances, opportunities, and evolving caution. Recognizing this paradox prevents both overlinking crimes that merely seem similar and missing connections between crimes that appear different on the surface but share deeper psychological continuity. Story 91: The Social Media Era. The emergence of social media created entirely new dimensions to serial killer investigation, providing unprecedented access to suspects' thoughts, behaviors, and connections while also creating new vulnerabilities and challenges for both investigators and potential victims. Modern killers leave digital breadcrumbs through social media activity that previous generations never faced, posts revealing their locations, photographs showing their possessions and environments, friend networks documenting their relationships, and sometimes disturbingly direct hints about violent fantasies or intentions. Investigators now routinely examine suspects' social media histories going back years, finding evidence of stalking behavior through repeated views of victims' profiles, concerning posts or searches, and patterns of online activity correlating with crime timings. Some killers have been caught because they posted photographs that inadvertently included evidence linking them to crimes, a distinctive item visible in the background, a location tag placing them where they claimed not to be, or metadata embedded in images revealing when and where photographs were taken. However, social media also changed victim vulnerability. Predators use these platforms to identify, research, and approach potential victims, learning their routines, interests, and social connections before making contact. The false sense of familiarity created by online interaction can lower victims' guards when they meet someone in person whom they've chatted with online, even though that person is essentially a stranger. Dating apps and social platforms became hunting grounds where killers could screen potential victims, practice their manipulation skills, and establish initial contact that seemed safer than random street encounters. The anonymity and distance of online communication also enable disturbing communities where violent fantasies are shared and normalized, with some individuals escalating from fantasy discussion to planning and eventually action. Law enforcement monitors certain online spaces, looking for individuals whose posts suggest movement from fantasy toward concrete planning, though distinguishing serious threats from fantasy roleplay among thousands of concerning posts creates massive resource challenges. The social media era fundamentally changed both how serial killers operate and how investigators pursue them, creating a landscape where digital forensics has become as crucial as traditional physical evidence in building cases and preventing future crimes. Story 92: The Interrogation Breakthrough Moments. Within the hours of interrogation that sometimes precede confession, specific psychological breakthrough moments occur when suspects' resistance collapses and they begin revealing truth. Understanding these moments helped investigators develop more effective techniques for obtaining crucial information. The breakthrough often comes not from aggressive confrontation but from unexpected psychological shifts, a moment when the suspect feels genuinely understood, when carrying the secret becomes more burdensome than revealing it, or when confronted with irrefutable evidence that makes continued denial seem futile and exhausting. Edmund Kemper's decision to call police and confess came from internal breakthrough. He realized he couldn't stop killing, feared what he would become if he continued, and felt almost relief at finally being able to discuss what he'd been hiding. His interrogation involved less breaking down resistance than providing opportunity for him to articulate what he'd been carrying alone. Dennis Rader's breakthrough came quickly after arrest. He seemed almost eager to discuss his crimes, his narcissism and need for recognition overwhelming any self-preservation instinct to remain silent. Investigators recognized his psychological needs and structured interviews to satisfy his ego while extracting information about unsolved murders. Gary Ridgway's breakthrough involved different dynamics. Faced with DNA evidence proving his guilt in several murders, and offered life imprisonment rather than execution in exchange for confessing to all his crimes and providing body locations, he made calculated decision that confession served his interests better than denial. The negotiation took time, with prosecutors making clear the deal's terms and Ridgway weighing his options before agreeing. Some breakthroughs come from exhaustion. After hours of questioning, maintaining lies becomes too difficult and suspects slip into truth almost accidentally, then find continuing honesty easier than returning to deception. Others come from strategic evidence presentation, showing suspects that investigators already know more than the suspect realized, making continued denial seem pointless. The most reliable breakthroughs involve suspects reaching genuine decision points where confession serves their psychological or practical needs, whether that's need for recognition, desire to unburden themselves, strategic calculation about legal consequences, or simply exhaustion with maintaining the facade. Modern interrogators study these breakthrough patterns, learning to recognize when they're approaching these moments and how to facilitate them without coercion that might create false confessions or render statements inadmissible in court. Story 93, The Unsolved Case Evolution. Some serial killer cases remain officially unsolved decades after the crimes, but understanding how these cold cases evolve, how new technology, renewed investigation, and fresh perspective sometimes bring resolution after seemingly impossible delays, provides hope for families and demonstrates that no case is ever truly closed. The Zodiac case remains California's most famous unsolved serial murder investigation, with hundreds of investigators over 50-plus years pursuing leads that never definitively identified the killer. In 2020, a team finally cracked the 340-character cipher using modern computational methods, revealing a taunting message but still not identifying who sent it. DNA from envelope adhesive offers potential for future identification through genetic genealogy, though degraded samples and contamination create challenges. The case demonstrates how even unsolved cases can see partial progress, ciphers solved, additional evidence analyzed, suspects eliminated through DNA, even without complete resolution. The Golden State Killer case showed the opposite trajectory. Unsolved for 40 years, the case seemed permanently cold until genetic genealogy breakthrough in 2018 led to Joseph DeAngelo's identification and arrest. His capture demonstrated that cases dormant for decades can suddenly break open when new technology or techniques are applied to preserved evidence. Investigative persistence matters enormously in cold case resolution. Many cases are solved by investigators who refuse to let them fade away, who reviewed evidence repeatedly, who submitted old samples for new DNA testing, who kept cases in public consciousness hoping for tips. Some cold cases are solved through deathbed confessions, with killers or their associates revealing information decades later when consequences no longer deter them. Others break when accomplices or witnesses who remain silent for years finally come forward after the killer dies or after their own circumstances change. The digital era created new possibilities for cold case investigation. Online databases allow comparison of unsolved murders across jurisdictions, finding patterns that investigators working in isolation might miss, and social media campaigns can generate tips from people with decades-old memories suddenly recognizing relevance. The evolution of unsolved cases reminds us that justice delayed isn't always justice denied, that families deserve answers regardless of time passage, and that the combination of preserved evidence, advancing technology, and determined investigators can sometimes achieve what once seemed impossible. Story 94: The Aftermath for Communities. Serial killer cases leave lasting scars on entire communities beyond individual victims' families, neighborhoods where killers operated, cities that became known for these crimes, and populations that lived in fear during active killing periods all experience collective trauma that persists long after cases close. The Green River Killer terrorized the Seattle-Tacoma area for nearly 20 years, with women disappearing regularly and bodies appearing in forests and rivers. The sex worker community lived in particular fear, with many leaving the area or changing their lives entirely to avoid victimization. Even after Gary Ridgway's 2001 arrest, the community carried trauma from decades of fear and loss. Atlanta's African American community experienced profound collective trauma during the Atlanta child murders of 1979 to 1981, when 29 African American children and young adults were murdered over 2 years. Parents kept children inside, changed daily routines, and lived in constant fear. Wayne Williams' conviction for 2 murders and association with many others brought some closure, but questions about whether he committed all the killings left lingering uncertainty. The Gainesville community in Florida was transformed by Danny Rowling's murders of 5 college students in August 1990. Students left the university, parents pulled children from school, and the sense of safety in the college town was shattered. Even after Rowling's capture and execution, Gainesville remained associated with those crimes. Communities sometimes resist the notoriety. Residents of Des Plaines, Illinois, where John Wayne Gacy lived and buried victims, struggled with their town becoming synonymous with his crimes. The house where murders occurred was demolished, the address was changed, and the community worked to establish identity beyond that dark chapter. The collective healing process in affected communities involves multiple elements: memorial services for victims, community support programs for traumatized residents, active efforts to establish new identity and positive associations, and time passage that allows new generations to know the area without personal memory of the fear. Some communities embrace the history as educational opportunity, tours, museums, or educational programs that ensure victims are remembered and lessons are learned. Others actively discourage true crime tourism, seeing it as exploitative commercialization of tragedy. The community aftermath of serial murder reveals how these crimes ripple far beyond individual victims, affecting hundreds or thousands of people who lived through the fear, carried the trauma, and must rebuild sense of safety and community identity after experiencing collective vulnerability to a predator in their midst. Story 95: The Investigative Technology Future. Looking forward, emerging technologies promise to revolutionize serial killer investigation in ways that might prevent murders, catch killers faster, and solve cold cases that current methods cannot address, though these advances also raise significant ethical and privacy questions. Artificial intelligence and machine learning applied to massive crime databases can identify patterns humans might miss, analyzing thousands of unsolved murders to find subtle connections suggesting a single perpetrator operating across jurisdictions over decades. The algorithms can process more variables and detect more complex patterns than human investigators working with spreadsheets and maps. Facial recognition technology continues advancing, with systems now capable of identifying individuals from partial faces, poor quality video, and even from gait analysis and body language when faces aren't visible. The proliferation of cameras means investigators have more footage to analyze, and AI can process thousands of hours of video to find specific individuals or vehicles. Advanced DNA analysis requiring smaller samples and capable of working with more degraded material expands the universe of solvable cases. Evidence once considered too degraded or contaminated for testing might yield results with next-generation techniques. Genetic genealogy will likely become more sophisticated, potentially identifying suspects from increasingly distant familial relationships, though privacy concerns and legal frameworks around accessing genealogical databases remain contentious. Predictive policing algorithms, controversial due to potential bias and civil liberties concerns, might identify patterns suggesting serial killer activity before cases are officially linked, allowing earlier intervention. Real-time data integration could alert investigators when certain combinations of factors appear, specific crime characteristics across multiple jurisdictions within defined timeframes, triggering automatic task force formation. However, these technological futures raise profound questions about surveillance society where tracking is ubiquitous, about privacy rights versus public safety, about algorithmic bias potentially directing investigation toward marginalized communities, and about whether preventing crime through predictive methods justifies the intrusion required. The balance between leveraging technology to protect society and preserving civil liberties remains an ongoing challenge, with serial killer cases representing the extreme end where the stakes of both catching criminals and protecting rights are highest. The future likely involves increasingly powerful investigative tools constrained by equally important legal and ethical frameworks, ensuring they're used appropriately and don't create dystopian surveillance state in pursuit of security. Story 96: The International Cooperation. As serial killers increasingly operate across international borders, the development of global cooperation frameworks has become essential, though jurisdictional challenges, differing legal systems, and communication barriers create obstacles that determined killers have historically exploited. Interpol maintains databases and facilitates cooperation between national police agencies, but participation varies by country and information sharing remains imperfect. When Charles Subhraj killed tourists across multiple Asian countries in the 1970s, limited international cooperation allowed him to operate for years, evading arrest by crossing borders when suspicion arose in one location. Modern agreements like European Union police cooperation and bilateral treaties between specific nations have improved coordination, but vast differences remain in how countries investigate crimes, what legal standards govern evidence collection, and whether extradition is possible when suspects are located. Andrei Chikatilo's crimes occurred entirely within the Soviet Union, but the ideological denial of serial killer existence there demonstrates how national attitudes and policies can obstruct investigation regardless of technical cooperation frameworks. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russian law enforcement began engaging more openly with Western experts, sharing information and techniques. The challenge of international investigation involves not just legal and procedural differences but also language barriers, cultural contexts affecting how crimes are understood and investigated, and resource disparities where wealthy nations have sophisticated forensic capabilities that developing nations cannot match. When evidence from one country must be analyzed in another, chain of custody issues and legal admissibility questions arise. Some countries refuse extradition of their citizens, creating safe havens where suspects can avoid prosecution by remaining within protective borders. The growing international cooperation represents progress, with agencies increasingly recognizing that mobile criminals require mobile investigation, but complete integration remains a distant goal requiring harmonization of laws, procedures, and priorities across nations with very different legal traditions and political systems. Serial killers who operate internationally, whether through travel for work or deliberate border crossing to exploit jurisdictional gaps, represent particular challenges requiring the highest levels of cooperation, and cases that successfully prosecute such criminals demonstrate how international frameworks can function when properly leveraged. Story 97: The Closure Question. Whether catching, prosecuting, and punishing serial killers truly provides closure to victims' families remains a deeply personal question with no universal answer. Some families report that justice brings peace, while others find that no outcome can heal their loss or answer their questions. The concept of closure itself may be misleading, suggesting that grief can be completed, that traumatic loss can be neatly resolved, when the reality for most families involves learning to carry loss rather than achieving freedom from it. Some families describe relief when killers are caught, tried, and sentenced, feeling that justice was served and that their loved one's murder was taken seriously by society. The trial process, though painful, can provide answers about what happened and why, and the perpetrator's punishment can feel like validation of the victim's worth. Other families find trials re-traumatizing, having to hear explicit details about how their loved one died, seeing the killer in person, enduring defense attorneys' questioning, and experiencing the public spectacle of their private tragedy. For these families, the legal process extends suffering rather than ending it. The question of execution versus life imprisonment affects closure differently for different families. Some feel execution provides appropriate finality and prevents their loved one's murderer from living while the victim cannot, while others oppose death penalty on principle or believe living with consequences constitutes greater punishment than escape through death. Gary Ridgway's confession as part of his plea deal provided information about additional victims and body locations, bringing closure to families who'd lived 20 years without knowing what happened to their daughters. However, watching Ridgway receive life imprisonment rather than execution left some families feeling justice was incomplete. The families who never receive answers, whose loved ones' murders remain unsolved or whose loved ones' bodies were never found, face particular challenges with closure, living indefinitely with uncertainty and unanswered questions. Support groups for families of murder victims provide spaces where these complex feelings can be shared without judgment, where people understand that closure isn't simple or universal, and where the journey of carrying loss can be traveled together. The reality is that catching serial killers serves multiple purposes, removing dangerous individuals from society, providing some answers, and demonstrating that victims matter, but it cannot restore what was taken, cannot undo trauma, and cannot provide the type of closure that returns families to who they were before the loss. Understanding this complexity helps set realistic expectations and provide space for families to experience whatever they feel after justice is served, whether that's relief, anger, emptiness, or a mixture that defies simple categorization. Story 98: The Research Ethics. Studying serial killers raises profound ethical questions about whether research that requires cooperation from murderers inadvertently provides them the attention they crave, whether insights gained justify the process, and how to conduct such research without exploitation or harm. The FBI's original interviews with imprisoned serial killers in the 1970s and 1980s proved invaluable for developing criminal profiling, but they also gave subjects like Edmund Kemper and Ted Bundy platforms and attention they clearly enjoyed. Researchers must weigh whether knowledge gained justifies providing narcissistic killers with the recognition they desire. Some argue that denying them attention is appropriate punishment and that research can be conducted through case file analysis without direct interviews. Others contend that first-hand accounts provide irreplaceable insights impossible to obtain through secondary sources, and that the potential to prevent future murders justifies uncomfortable cooperation with convicted killers. The challenge intensifies when researchers must maintain some rapport to encourage openness. Creating relationships with subjects whose crimes are reprehensible requires psychological compartmentalization and raises questions about whether showing any respect or empathy to murderers somehow diminishes victims. Most researchers emphasize that respect for human dignity during interviews doesn't equal condoning crimes, and that understanding evil requires engaging with those who committed it. Publication ethics matter too. How research is presented, whether it focuses appropriately on victims rather than glorifying killers, and whether findings are used responsibly for prevention and investigation rather than entertainment. Some families of victims strongly oppose research involving killers, seeing it as giving murderers platforms they don't deserve and finding the academic detachment painful when discussing their loved ones' deaths. Informed consent raises questions when research subjects are incarcerated. Are they truly free to decline participation, or do prison dynamics and hopes for benefits create coercive elements? The institutional review boards overseeing research must carefully evaluate whether studies meet ethical standards, provide genuine benefits that justify any harms, and respect both subjects' rights and victims' dignity. As true crime content proliferates, distinguishing serious research from exploitative entertainment becomes crucial. Research should advance understanding, improve prevention and investigation, and treat all involved with appropriate gravity, while entertainment often sensationalizes, focuses on shock value, and treats tragedy as content to be consumed. The ongoing debate about research ethics in this field reflects broader questions about how we balance learning from terrible events against respecting those harmed and ensuring we don't inadvertently contribute to the very phenomena we're trying to understand and prevent. Welcome to a journey through the darker corners of criminal history. Tonight, we'll explore 100 stories about some of the most infamous serial killers the world has known. Let these tales carry you gently into sleep as we examine the patterns, the investigations, and the psychology behind these cases. Close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's begin. Story 1: The Origins of the Term. Our first story takes us back to the 1970s, when the term serial killer itself was born. Before FBI agent Robert Ressler coined this phrase, these criminals were called many things: mass murderers, spree killers, or simply monsters. Ressler drew inspiration from the serial adventure films of his childhood, where audiences would return week after week for the next installment. He realized that these killers operated in a similar pattern, committing murders in a series, with cooling-off periods in between. The FBI formally adopted the term in the 1970s, defining a serial killer as someone who murders 3 or more victims in separate events with emotional cooling-off periods between kills. This distinction separated them from mass murderers, who kill many people at once, and spree killers, who murder multiple victims without a cooling-off period. The term revolutionized how law enforcement approached these cases, allowing them to identify patterns and develop profiles. By 1988, the definition was refined further at a symposium in San Antonio, Texas, where experts from around the world gathered to establish consistent criteria. This linguistic shift wasn't just academic, it fundamentally changed investigative techniques and helped catch killers who might otherwise have continued their crimes across multiple jurisdictions. Story 2: The Behavioral Science Unit. In the 1970s, deep in the basement of the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, something extraordinary was taking shape. A small team of agents began doing what had never been systematically done before, interviewing imprisoned serial killers to understand how they thought. Special agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler would travel to prisons across America, sitting down face-to-face with the most dangerous criminals in the country. They interviewed Edmund Kemper, who stood 6'9" and had murdered his own grandparents as a teenager before going on to kill 6 young women and his mother. They spoke with Charles Manson, Richard Speck, and dozens of others. These conversations, often lasting hours, revealed patterns that had never been documented. The agents learned that many serial killers had experienced childhood trauma, particularly between the ages of 8 and 12. They discovered the concept of the homicidal triad, bedwetting, fire setting, and cruelty to animals in childhood, though later research would show this wasn't as predictive as initially thought. Most importantly, they learned that these criminals could be categorized into organized and disorganized types based on their crime scenes. This groundbreaking work laid the foundation for modern criminal profiling, transforming it from guesswork into a systematic investigative tool that has helped solve countless cases. Story 3: The Organized Mind. Let's drift into understanding the organized serial killer, a type that plans meticulously and leaves little evidence behind. These individuals lead what appears to be normal lives. They have jobs, relationships, and blend seamlessly into society. Ted Bundy exemplified this type perfectly. He was charismatic, educated, and worked on political campaigns. He carefully selected victims who resembled each other, approached them with elaborate ruses, and transported them to pre-selected locations. The organized killer typically has above-average intelligence and follows their crimes closely in the media. They often take souvenirs from victims, not as trophies in the traditional sense, but as memory triggers to relive the experience. Their crime scenes show evidence of planning. They bring weapons and restraints, control the victim, and often clean up afterward. BTK killer Dennis Rader represented this type as well, maintaining a family life and career while meticulously documenting his crimes. These killers engage in conversation with victims, sometimes for hours, as psychological domination is part of their motivation. They are often geographically mobile, which historically made them difficult to catch before modern databases connected crimes across jurisdictions. Understanding this organized pattern helped investigators realize they weren't looking for the obvious suspect, the loner or drifter, but someone who might be their neighbor, colleague, or even friend. Story 4: The Disorganized Reality. Now let's turn to the disorganized serial killer, whose crimes tell a very different story. These individuals act on impulse, leaving chaotic crime scenes that reveal much about their state of mind. The disorganized killer typically has below-average intelligence and struggles with mental illness. They often live alone or with a parent, have poor social skills, and work in menial jobs if employed at all. Their crimes are spontaneous. They use whatever weapon is available at the scene rather than bringing one. The victim is usually someone from their own neighborhood, killed quickly without prolonged interaction. Richard Chase, known as the Vampire Killer of Sacramento, demonstrated this pattern dramatically in the late 1970s. He suffered from severe mental illness and chose victims based on whether their doors were unlocked, interpreting a locked door as a sign he wasn't welcome. His crime scenes were extremely chaotic, with evidence left everywhere. The disorganized killer makes little effort to hide the body or clean the scene, often leaving the victim at the initial attack location. They typically don't follow media coverage of their crimes and may have amnesia-like gaps in memory about the events. Unlike their organized counterparts, they rarely take souvenirs, though they might engage in unusual behavior with the body itself. Understanding this classification helped investigators narrow suspect pools dramatically. They could estimate the killer's intelligence, living situation, and even employment status based on what the crime scene revealed. Story 5: The FBI's Database Revolution. As the 1980s unfolded, the FBI realized that information was the key to catching serial killers who crossed state lines. In 1985, they launched VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. This revolutionary database allowed law enforcement agencies across the country to input details about violent crimes and search for similar cases. Before VICAP, a killer moving from California to Florida could operate with near impunity, as police departments had no efficient way to connect crimes across jurisdictions. The system required officers to fill out detailed questionnaires about crime scenes, victim characteristics, and suspect behavior. The computer would then search for pattern matches. Within its first decade, VICAP helped connect numerous cases that had seemed unrelated. Story 99: The Cultural Differences. Serial murder manifests differently across cultures, and understanding these variations reveals how social structures, law enforcement systems, and cultural values influence both how these crimes occur and how they're investigated and prosecuted. In Japan, serial killers are relatively rare, and when they do emerge, cases often involve different patterns than Western killers, more focus on financial gain, less sexual motivation, and different victim selection reflecting Japanese social structures. Miyuki Ishikawa killed over 100 infants through her maternity hospital in the 1940s, a crime type reflecting specific cultural and economic circumstances of post-war Japan. In countries with more collective cultures emphasizing group harmony and conformity, serial killers often experience different psychological pressures than in individualistic Western societies. The shame of exposure affects not just the individual but their entire family and community, creating additional motivations for concealment. Latin American serial killers like Luis Garavito in Colombia and Pedro Lopez across South America targeted street children, a vulnerable population reflecting economic inequality and social structures where impoverished children lived on margins with minimal protection. The massive victim counts: Garavito confessed to 138 murders, though the real number may exceed 300, reflected both opportunity and investigative limitations in regions where resources were constrained. Cultural attitudes toward sexuality, violence, and authority affect investigation. In some societies, reporting crimes against sex workers or marginalized people is discouraged, allowing killers targeting these populations to operate longer. Legal system differences create varying outcomes. Some countries have no death penalty, some have it but rarely use it, and some apply it regularly. These differences affect whether killers like Garavito, who received relatively lenient sentences under Colombian law, would face execution elsewhere. The role of media varies by culture too. Some societies maintain stricter privacy protections and less sensationalistic coverage, while others embrace true crime content similar to Western patterns. Understanding cultural differences in serial murder helps investigators working international cases, reveals how social structures create or reduce vulnerability, and demonstrates that while the psychological roots of serial killing show universal elements, the specific manifestations vary significantly based on cultural context. Story 100: The Final Perspective. As we reach the 100th story in this journey through darkness, it's worth reflecting on what all these cases, investigations, and outcomes ultimately reveal about human nature, justice, and society's ongoing effort to understand and prevent the worst crimes humans commit against each other. These 100 stories represent thousands of individual victims, thousands more family members forever changed by loss, countless investigators who devoted careers to pursuing justice, and communities that experienced collective trauma. Behind the statistics, the psychological profiles, and the forensic techniques lie profound human experiences, terror and suffering, dedication and courage, grief and resilience. What we've learned through decades of studying serial killers includes humbling recognition of how little we truly understand, why some people develop into serial murderers while others facing similar circumstances don't, how to reliably predict who poses danger, and how to prevent all such crimes. We've learned that serial killers are not supernatural monsters but flawed humans whose particular combination of genetics, neurology, environment, and choice led them down paths that most of us cannot fathom taking. We've learned that justice, though imperfect, remains essential, that societies must protect their most vulnerable members, that every victim deserves investigation regardless of their lifestyle, and that the pursuit of those who repeatedly take innocent lives serves fundamental purpose even when it's frustratingly difficult and emotionally costly. We've learned that prevention requires addressing root causes, childhood trauma, social inequality, mental health access, support for vulnerable populations, not just catching killers after they've already destroyed lives. Most importantly, perhaps, we've learned that behind each case are victims who deserve to be remembered as the people they were, with hopes, dreams, relationships, and value, not reduced to statistics or defined solely by how they died. The families who lost them deserve to be heard, supported, and treated with dignity throughout processes that often extend over decades. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let these 100 stories serve their purpose, not to glorify violence or those who commit it, but to understand darkness better so that light can more effectively counter it. Rest now, knowing that dedicated investigators continue working to solve unsolved cases, that advancing technology brings new hope to cold case families, that reforms in law enforcement and social services work to prevent future tragedies, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, pursues those who prey upon the innocent. The night is quiet now, and you are safe. These stories have carried you through the darkness toward understanding, toward morning, toward rest. Sleep peacefully. Thank you for joining us on this journey through 100 stories about some of criminal history's darkest chapters. May these tales have brought understanding, may the victims be remembered with dignity, and may you rest well through the night ahead.